The morning Ronan Hale rode into Cartwell was the kind of morning the frontier produces without apology. Gray sky pressing down on gray earth, a wind sharp enough to make your ears ache, the smell of pine resin and horse dung mixing together in a way that reminded you exactly where you were and how little it cared about you. He hadn't planned to stay long. He never did. His supply list was short: salt, rifle cartridges, a length of rope, and if the general store still stocked them, a box of the wax-sealed matches that didn't go damp in mountain weather. Maybe 30 minutes of human contact, 45 if the storekeeper wanted to talk. Then back up into the Blackstones before anyone had the time or the nerve to remember his name. He tied his horse outside Greer's Goods on the main street and didn't look at anyone. That was the arrangement he kept with the world. He left it alone and expected the same in return. For 3 years it had worked. For 10 years before that, it had mostly worked, after a fashion. The bell above Greer's door jangled when he pushed it open. An old man looked up from behind the counter. Not Greer, but a boy Ronan didn't recognize, maybe 17, with ink-stained fingers and the wide, startled eyes of someone who'd been told stories about a man matching Ronan's description and hadn't quite believed them until this moment. "Morning," Ronan said. "Morning." The boy's voice cracked on the second syllable. Ronan set his list on the counter without further ceremony and moved toward the shelves to locate the matches himself. The store smelled of coffee and sawdust and old wood. It was a small smell, a human smell. He didn't hate it. He just didn't need it. He was examining a coil of rope near the back wall when he heard the noise from outside. Not fighting, not gunfire. Something stranger. The sound of a crowd doing something it was ashamed of. A kind of controlled murmur, the particular acoustic signature of a group of people choosing not to ask questions they already knew the answers to. Ronan moved to the window. The chapel stood 2 buildings down from Greer's, and its double doors had been thrown open wide. People lined the steps and spilled into the street. Not mourners, not worshippers. Dressed too well for a Tuesday. The women stood with their arms folded across their bodies like they were cold, or like they were trying to hold something in. The men stood the way men stand when they've decided something distasteful is also necessary. "What's happening at the chapel?" Ronan asked. The boy behind the counter didn't answer immediately. Ronan turned around to find him studying the surface of the counter with unusual intensity. "Boy? It's..." The boy cleared his throat. "It's a marriage arrangement for Miss Evelyn Mercer. Her father passed last spring, left the family in debt to the bank. Mr. Vaughn's been patient about it, people say." "Vaughn, Cedric Vaughn, owns the bank." The boy paused. "And the mill, and 3 of the cattle operations east of the ridge." "How old is Miss Mercer?" Another pause. 22, 23, maybe? "And Vaughn?" The boy's jaw moved for a moment without producing sound. 54. Ronan looked back at the window. Through the open chapel doors he could see the edge of something. A podium, people arranged in rows, and at the far end of the aisle what appeared to be a young woman standing very still, in a way that didn't look like stillness so much as controlled drowning. He set the rope down. "Leave the list," he said. "I'll be back." He didn't walk fast. Running would have made it look like panic, and whatever was happening inside that chapel, Ronan had no intention of arriving at it, panicked. He moved the way he moved through the mountains, deliberate, reading the ground ahead of him, committing nothing until he understood the terrain. What he understood by the time he reached the chapel steps was this: the crowd was real, the approval was performance, and nobody standing on those steps actually wanted to be there, but not one of them had any intention of saying so out loud. He went up the steps and through the doors. The interior was warm from packed bodies, and smelled of candle wax and the kind of anxiety that produces sweat. Every pew was occupied. At the front of the chapel stood a man Ronan did not recognize. Heavy-set, well-dressed, hair silver at the temples, the kind of face that had learned a long time ago how to arrange itself into expressions of patience while thinking about something else entirely. Cedric Vaughn. Beside him stood a minister, older, gray-bearded, holding a book and looking somewhere between uncomfortable and resigned, the expression of a man who had told himself this was legal. Therefore it was acceptable. Therefore he could sleep. And then there was the woman. Evelyn Mercer stood at the altar with her hands clasped in front of her, her back absolutely straight, wearing a dress that looked like it had been chosen by someone other than her, pale ivory, formal, wrong in some specific way that Ronan couldn't name, except to say that she looked like a woman wearing a costume of someone she was not. She was not crying. That was the first thing he noticed. She was not looking at Vaughn, not looking at the minister, not looking at any particular point in the room. Her eyes were fixed somewhere around the middle distance, that specific stare that people develop when they have decided to endure something by refusing to fully inhabit the moment it is happening. Ronan had seen that stare before. He had worn it himself. The minister was speaking, the formal cadence of ceremony, but Ronan stopped hearing the words because he was watching Evelyn's hands. They were clasped in front of her, white-knuckled, the fingers laced together not in prayer but in the grip of a person holding themselves together from the inside. He stood at the back of the chapel for approximately 40 seconds. Then he walked down the aisle. The murmur started before he reached the third row. By the fifth row, it had grown into something that turned heads. By the time he reached the front, the minister had stopped speaking, and the entire room was looking at him with expressions ranging from confusion to alarm. Cedric Vaughn turned slowly. His eyes traveled up Ronan's frame with the calculating assessment of a man accustomed to measuring what things cost and what they were worth. "This service is private," Vaughn said. His voice was pleasant, the voice of a man who didn't raise it because he'd never needed to. "So I see." Ronan looked at Evelyn for the first time. Up close, she was different from how she'd appeared from the doorway. Her eyes were dark, the color of creek water in shadow, and they were looking at him now with an expression he couldn't read immediately. Not fear, not hope, something more guarded than either. "I'm interrupting," Ronan said to her. She said nothing. "You can tell me to leave." He said it plainly, no performance in it. "If that's what you want, say it and I'll go." Vaughn stepped forward. "Now listen here. I don't know who you think you are, but this arrangement has been agreed upon and witnessed. I'm talking to Miss Mercer." Ronan didn't raise his voice either, which seemed to disturb Vaughn more than shouting would have. "Not to you." The silence in the chapel was the particular kind that has weight. Evelyn's eyes moved between Ronan and Vaughn, and for a moment her face was entirely unguarded, the controlled drowning expression gone, replaced by something raw, something that was trying very hard to calculate the odds on a problem it had never expected to have the opportunity to calculate. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, controlled. "Ronan Hale." The name went through the room like a stone dropped into still water. He heard it, the intake of breath, the shift of bodies, the whispered repetition from row to row. He was used to it by now. The name had preceded him for a decade, carrying the weight of things that had happened in it, things he hadn't chosen and things he had. "I know what they say about me," he told Evelyn. "I'm not going to tell you it's all wrong, because some of it isn't. But I'll tell you this." He looked at Vaughn briefly, then back at her. "Whatever he is, and whatever I am, you deserve to choose between us, not have the choice made for you." Vaughn's pleasantness had developed an edge. "The lady's debts? How much?" Ronan said. A pause. "What?" "The debt. How much?" Vaughn's eyes narrowed slightly. $460. Ronan reached inside his coat and pulled out a leather pouch that landed on the altar rail with a dense, metallic sound. He'd been carrying it for reasons he hadn't examined. Emergency funds, he'd told himself, for situations that required immediate solutions. "Count it," he said. Nobody moved for a moment. Then the minister, apparently deciding that participation in whatever this was constituted a neutral act, reached forward and undid the pouch strings with slightly trembling fingers. He counted, slowly, the coins making small, deliberate sounds against the wood. $480, the minister said. Vaughn stared at the coins. His jaw was set. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger exactly, but the recalculation of a man who had not anticipated this variable. "The arrangement was for debt," Ronan said. "The debt's cleared." He looked at Evelyn. "That doesn't mean you owe me anything. You can walk out of here free and that's the end of it." Evelyn looked at the coins on the altar rail, then at Vaughn, then at Ronan. "Or," she said. "Or," Ronan said, "you could marry me instead." I've got land in the Blackstones and a roof that doesn't leak, mostly, and I won't be kind to you all the time because I'm not built for it, but I won't harm you, and I won't sell you." The chapel was silent enough that someone in the back row coughed, and everyone heard it. Evelyn Mercer looked at Ronan Hale for a long moment. She looked at him the way someone looks at a problem that has no clean solution, searching for the angle that makes it workable, checking for the trap, trying to read the thing beneath the thing. Then she looked back at Vaughn. Vaughn, who had been patient. Vaughn, who owned the bank and the mill and the cattle operations east of the ridge. "Yes," she said, quietly, to Ronan. The room erupted. The ceremony, if it could be called that, lasted 11 minutes. The minister performed it with the efficiency of someone who wanted to have this transaction completed before he had the opportunity to reconsider his involvement in it. He didn't meet Ronan's eyes. He barely met Evelyn's. He read the words from the book with the careful neutrality of a man reciting an inventory. Ronan said the required words without embellishment. Evelyn said them with her chin lifted at an angle that dared anyone in the room to comment. When it was done, they walked out of the chapel side by side into the thin morning light, and the crowd that had pressed around the doors parted for them with the uncertainty of a group of people who had witnessed something they hadn't prepared an opinion for. Vaughn didn't follow them outside. Through the chapel windows, Ronan could see him standing at the front of the room, very still, in conversation with two men Ronan didn't recognize. Broad-shouldered, suited, the kind of stillness that wasn't peace. Ronan filed that image away and kept walking. "You have a horse?" he asked Evelyn. "A mule," she said. "Stabled at Hennessy's." "Get it. We leave within the hour." She stopped walking. "I need to go to the house first." He stopped too. "For what?" "My things." There was a precision to her voice, a measured quality that reminded him oddly of the way you handled a loaded firearm. Careful, but not afraid. "I have books and a winter coat and certain items that belong to my mother. I won't leave without them." Ronan looked at her for a moment. "How long?" "Less than an hour. I'll be at Greer's." He paused. "I need to finish buying rope." She blinked at him. He wasn't sure if it was confusion or the beginning of something else, some fractional adjustment in the read she was taking of him. "All right," she said. He went to Greer's. She went to the house. The boy at the counter watched him with the expression of someone who had just become accidentally adjacent to a legend and wasn't certain how to process it. Ronan paid for his supplies, had them loaded onto his horse, and stood outside for 40 minutes watching the street. Several people looked at him. Most looked away quickly. He was accustomed to this. One man, older, a farmer by the look of him, stopped a few feet away and said quietly, "That was a decent thing you did." Ronan looked at him. The farmer nodded once, like a period at the end of a sentence, and walked on. Evelyn returned with 52 minutes elapsed, which was closer to an hour than she'd suggested. She was carrying a canvas bag over one shoulder and a smaller leather satchel in her hand, and she was walking fast, her jaw set. He noticed her eyes moving in the direction of the chapel as she crossed the street toward him. "Vaughn?" he asked. "His men are watching the house." She said it without drama, the way you report weather conditions. "Two of them. I don't think they touched anything, but they were inside." She paused. "Looking for something." Ronan thought about that. "Looking for what?" "I don't know." Her eyes came to his. "My father had papers, financial documents, correspondence. I could only find some of them. The rest were already gone." He absorbed this. "Did you take what you needed?" "Yes." "Then we go." She had collected the mule from Hennessy's before coming to find him. It stood loaded and patient behind her, a solid gray-brown animal with the philosophical expression of a creature that has learned not to invest emotionally in the decisions of its owners. They rode out of Cartwell together without ceremony, without looking back, and without speaking for the first 3 miles. The mountain road was narrow and steep, the kind of road that demanded attention from horses and riders alike. Pine forest closed around them gradually as they climbed, the sound of the town fading into the hiss of wind through branches. Evelyn rode without complaint. She handled the mule competently, adjusting to the grade without being told, reading the road ahead. He noticed this. "You've ridden mountain roads before," he said. My father and I went into the Blackstones twice when I was young. He liked to collect geological samples. A pause. He was a man of many interests and poor judgment in investments. When did he die? Last March. Fever. Her voice didn't change on the word. It was quick. He didn't offer condolences. He had learned that people who were managing grief with silence generally preferred to continue managing it that way. They rode another mile in quiet. I need to say something, Evelyn said. He waited. I don't know you, she said. I don't know why you did what you did this morning. I don't know what kind of man you actually are underneath the reputation, and I won't pretend the reputation doesn't exist because it does. I've heard the stories. She paused. What I'm saying is that I accepted your offer because the alternative was Cedric Vaughn, and not because I'm naive or grateful or frightened enough to accept whatever arrangement you put forward. Ronan considered this for a moment. That's fair. I'd like to know, she said, what you expect. I told you in the chapel. You told me what you weren't going to do. That's not the same thing. He looked at her. She was watching the road ahead, her profile composed. She was asking a real question, and she was asking it without softness, without apology. He respected this. I expect you to carry your weight, he said. The mountain isn't easy. There's work every day, and some of it's hard. I expect you to learn what you need to learn and not wait to be taught everything. And I expect, he paused, choosing the word deliberately, honesty. If something's wrong, say it. If something's not working, say it. I can't work with silence. She was quiet for a moment. And in return? In return, I'll keep what I told you. You won't be harmed in my house. What's mine is shared, including what I know about surviving up there. He nodded toward the peaks visible above the tree line. And if you decide after some time that this was a mistake, I'll help you find a way out that doesn't leave you worse than you started. She was silent long enough that he thought she might not respond. That's more than I expected, she said finally. Not warmly, honestly. I'm not trying to be more than I am, Ronan said, just trying to be clear about what I am. The trail curved upward through a section of old-growth pine, the trunks thick as wagon wheels, the light filtering down in long, slanted bars. Somewhere above them, a bird, a mountain jay from the sound, issued its sharp, complaining call. Evelyn shifted the canvas bag on her shoulder and looked at the sky between the branches. How far? She asked. 3 more hours, Ronan said. If the weather holds. The weather held. The cabin was not what she had imagined. In truth, she hadn't known what to imagine. The stories about Ronan Hale were long on violence and short on domestic detail. She had constructed something in her mind during the ride that was roughly equal parts ruin and threat, a place that matched the mythology of the man. What she found was a low, solid structure built from mountain pine, weathered gray but tight-fitted, the kind of construction that announced someone had understood building not as an aesthetic act, but as a survival problem. There was a covered porch facing south, which meant maximum sun in winter, a woodpile that stood nearly as tall as she did, stacked with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about how much wood a winter required. A small outbuilding, for tools or animals, she couldn't tell, set 20 yards to the east. A creek visible through the trees below. It was not pretty. It was extremely competent. The outbuilding is for the horse, Ronan said, dismounting. The mule can go in too. I'll show you where the feed's stored. She dismounted and looked at the cabin. Is there a bedroom? 1. I'll sleep in the front room. She looked at him. Until whatever this is becomes something else, he added. The phrasing was careful, and she noted it. Or doesn't. Either way, that's how it starts. All right, she said. She took the mule to the outbuilding while Ronan handled his horse, and in the process of locating the feed and the water trough, she began constructing a preliminary map of the property, where things were, how they were arranged, what the logic of the place was. She had always done this in new environments. Her father had called it cartographic anxiety. She called it knowing where you were. She found the feed stored in a wooden bin with a close-fitted lid, correctly kept to prevent mice. There were tools hanging on the outbuilding wall in ordered arrangement. Axe, adze, 2 types of saw, various implements she couldn't immediately name. Everything had a place and was in it. She returned to find Ronan building a fire in the stone hearth, moving with the economy of someone who had done this 10,000 times without thought. Can you cook? He asked without turning around. Yes. Supplies are in the pantry off the kitchen. There's venison hanging in the cold room. The door on the north side of the cabin. He sat back on his heels and looked at the fire catching. Take what you need. She took stock of the pantry. Flour, salt, dried beans, cornmeal, preserved apples, various dried herbs she'd have to identify by smell. The cold room held, as advertised, a haunch of venison hanging from a rafter hook, along with smoked fish and what appeared to be a wheel of hard cheese wrapped in cloth. She made a stew. It wasn't inspired. She was tired and the kitchen was unfamiliar, but it was hot and adequate and she made enough for two. She set a bowl on the table in front of Ronan without announcement. He looked at it briefly, looked at her, and picked up the spoon. They ate in silence. When the bowls were empty, she cleared them, and when she came back from the kitchen, she found him adding a log to the fire, his back to the room. There's something I want to tell you, she said. He didn't turn around. Go ahead. Cedric Vaughn didn't just want to clear the debt, she said. My father was his accountant for 12 years. Before he died, he started to... She paused, arranging her words. He started asking questions about things he'd handled without understanding. Money moving in ways that didn't add up. He wrote to me about it, said he'd found something. She hesitated. He died 3 weeks after he wrote that letter. Ronan turned then, looked at her. I think Vaughn knew, she said, about the letter, about what my father found. I think that's why his men were already in the house before we left, before the ceremony was even finished. She met his eyes. They weren't looking for financial documents. They were making sure those documents couldn't be found. The fire snapped in the silence. Did they find what they were looking for? Ronan asked. I don't know. She reached into the leather satchel and set 3 folded papers on the table. These were hidden in the back of my father's desk, beneath the false bottom. I almost missed them. She paused. I don't know yet what they say. I haven't had the chance to read them carefully. Ronan moved to the table and looked at the papers without touching them. Then you should read them, he said. Tonight, if you can. Yes, she said. Tonight. She sat at the table with the papers and the lamp. He retreated to the front room, and she heard the sounds of him moving around, settling, the quiet sounds of a person used to being alone in a space, making the small adjustments required by the presence of another. She unfolded the papers. The first one was a ledger page, dense with numbers, with her father's neat handwriting in the margins. The notations meant very little to her without context, but certain columns were circled in red ink, and beside them, in a hand more urgent than her father's usual precision, he had written, not accounted for anywhere. Months 4 to 9. Where does it go? The second paper was a letter, unsigned, undated. The handwriting was not her father's. She read it twice. Her hands went still on the table. Outside the cabin, the wind moved through the pines, and the fire settled, and the lamp made its small circle of warmth, and Evelyn Mercer sat at the table of a stranger's home, reading words that changed the shape of everything she thought she understood. She set the paper down carefully, the way you set down something fragile, even though it was only paper, even though the damage was already done. Hail, she said. A pause. Then, from the front room, yeah. I need you to read something. Another pause, longer. Then the sound of his footsteps, steady and deliberate, crossing the wooden floor toward her. She had come to the mountains expecting to endure. She had not expected this. The ledgers, the circled columns, the unsigned letter and its terrible implication, and the man appearing in the doorway behind the lamp's reach, watching her face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read what people don't say. What is it? He said. She pushed the letter across the table to him. He picked it up. He read it standing, without sitting, without expression. She watched his face and saw the moment the meaning landed. A slight tension around the jaw, a stillness in the eyes. Who sent this? He asked. I don't know, she said, but look at the date in the margin. He looked. That's 6 days before my father died, she said. The cabin was quiet. The fire burned. Outside, the mountains held their cold, ancient silence, indifferent to the small human catastrophe being assembled on a kitchen table by lamplight. We need to talk, Ronan said. Yes, Evelyn said. We do. She hadn't come to the mountains to fight anyone. She'd come to survive Cedric Vaughn. But survival, she was beginning to understand, was going to require something more than distance. Over the weeks that followed, the cabin became, reluctantly and then more willingly, something approaching a functional household. This was not a smooth process. They moved around each other with the deliberateness of two people navigating a space neither of them had chosen, learning the other's patterns through repeated small collisions and adjustments. He woke before dawn. She learned this on the second morning when she heard the door and looked out the window to find him already at the woodpile in the pre-dawn gray, his breath visible in the cold air, moving with a rhythm that suggested this was not a performance of industry, but simply what he did. She got up and made coffee. When he came in an hour later, stamping the cold off his boots, there was a cup on the table and she was already at the other end of it, working through the ledger pages she'd brought from Cartwell. He looked at the coffee. He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. "I made enough for the pot," she said, without looking up. "It's on the stove." This became, without either of them deciding it, the shape of their mornings. He taught her to shoot in the second week. She'd handled a firearm before. Her father had kept a small revolver that he'd shown her the basic mechanics of, the kind of perfunctory education that translated into theoretical knowledge without practical skill. Ronan's approach was different. He handed her a rifle on a Tuesday morning with the same matter-of-fact quality he brought to every instruction and said, "You'll need to understand this before it matters." The emphasis on before registered. They went to a flat section of ground east of the cabin where he'd set up a target, a wooden square nailed to a post, nothing elegant about it. He showed her the loading, the stance, the relationship between breath and trigger, without excess words or ceremony. She missed the target completely on the first 3 shots. She didn't apologize for this, which seemed to satisfy something in him. He adjusted her stance with a brief, impersonal correction. Left foot forward, more weight there, and moved back. She hit the edge of the target on the 4th shot. "Again?" he said. She hit the center on the 7th. Something shifted in his expression, not quite approval, but the acknowledgement of a thing observed. "You adjust fast," he said. "I was a good student," she said, "in all subjects." "Different subjects up here." "I'm aware." She reloaded with the focused concentration she brought to everything new. "Show me again how you reload in low light." He looked at her for a moment. "Why low light specifically?" "Because if I ever need this, it probably won't be afternoon." She met his eyes. "I don't want to practice a skill I'll only need in comfortable conditions." He was quiet for a moment, and she'd learned enough about his particular silences by then to recognize this one as the kind where something was being reconsidered rather than refused. "Come back at dusk," he said. She came back at dusk, and then at dawn, and then in rain, when the mountains produced 2 days of cold, driving precipitation that made everything wet and visibility difficult. And she went out anyway because she'd decided that difficulty was the only teacher that mattered. He noticed this. He didn't comment on it, but he began adjusting the lessons accordingly. Harder targets, greater distances, conditions that demanded more. It was the respect of someone who taught in proportion to what the student could receive. One evening, she caught him watching her from the porch as she practiced splitting wood at the far edge of the clearing. She'd been at it long enough that her arms were tired and her form was deteriorating, the axe pulling slightly left on the downswing. "You're exhausted," he said when she looked up. "I'm finishing the pile," she said. "You'll injure yourself with sloppy mechanics." She drove the axe into the block and straightened, rolling the ache out of her shoulder. "I know my limits." "You know your previous limits," he said. "Up here they're different." He came down from the porch. "Take the axe lower on the handle. When you're tired, the grip slides up. Lower grip gives you more control." She repositioned her hands. The next swing was cleaner. "There," he said. She didn't thank him in words. She kept splitting. He went back to the porch and she could feel him not watching, which she'd discovered was also a quality of his. The ability to give someone the sense of being unobserved even in close proximity, which she'd come to understand was one of the ways he expressed consideration. The nights were harder than the days. Not because of conflict. They were civil in the evenings, speaking of practical things, occasionally reading near the fire, developing the small conversational habits of people sharing space. But in the evenings, the papers on the table were always present, and the meaning of what they'd found could not be entirely set aside by exhaustion or practical activity. Her father's ledger pages told a story in numbers, money that moved in and out of accounts with no corresponding documentation, sums that were logged as expenses but had no associated invoices, patterns that repeated quarterly over a span of 7 years with the regularity of something systematic and intentional. The unsigned letter was something different. It was a warning. Written to no one named by someone unnamed, it described a series of events in careful, oblique language. 3 incidents of property acquisition that followed suspicious deaths, a judge in the eastern county who had been made comfortable in various ways, a territorial official whose cooperation had been secured through means the letter declined to specify directly. Whoever had written it had known enough to be afraid. The careful language, the absence of signatures, these were the marks of someone writing down what they knew while trying to remain invisible. And the date, 6 days before her father died, was either coincidence or it wasn't. "Do you think he knew my father had found this?" she asked Ronan one evening. He didn't need to ask who she meant. Vaughn? If my father was his accountant for 12 years, if he was handling these accounts, seeing these numbers, at some point Vaughn would have had to know that exposure was possible, that my father had access to information that could be dangerous. "Yes," Ronan said. He was looking at the fire, not at her. "So the question is whether he was careful enough, long enough." She folded her hands on the table. "And whether the fever was the fever." He looked at her then. "I know how that sounds," she said. "It sounds like a person who's thought it through," he said. "Not like someone making accusations they can't support." "I can't support it. Not yet." She looked at the papers. "But if what this letter says is true, if those property acquisitions are what they appear to be, then Vaughn has done this before. More than once. And if there was someone who could document it, then that person became a problem," Ronan said. She exhaled slowly. "Yes." The fire burned. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving through the trees with a sound like distant conversation. The mountain speaking in a language she was only beginning to learn. "My father was a good man," she said, which was not something she had said out loud since his death, and the saying of it did something complicated to the carefully maintained composure she'd been carrying since that morning in the chapel. He was not a careful man. He trusted too easily and understood people less well than he understood numbers. But he was good. She paused. "If Vaughn did what I think he might have—" "You want justice," Ronan said. "Yes. Not revenge." She thought about the distinction. "No. Not revenge. Revenge would be smaller than what this deserves." She looked at him. "I want him to be held accountable, publicly, by law, in a way he can't buy or threaten his way out of." Ronan was quiet for a long moment. "That requires more evidence than we have," he said. "I know. And delivering evidence means going back. I know that too." She held his gaze. "I'm not ready to talk about how yet, but I'm telling you what I want so we understand each other." He nodded slowly. This was the thing she had begun to understand about Ronan Hale. He was not a man who offered false comfort or easy agreement. When he said nothing, he meant nothing. When he nodded, it meant he had actually heard and was actually considering. There was no performance of response in him, no reflexive reassurance. It was disconcerting, and then it was something she trusted more than most of what she'd known. Outside, the mountain held its ground against the wind. Inside the cabin, the fire burned, the papers sat waiting on the table, and 2 people who had come together through the strangest possible combination of desperation and accident sat in the particular silence of those who are beginning to understand that they are no longer quite alone. The morning the wanted posters appeared in Cartwell, Ronan found out through the trader who came up the mountain path twice monthly with mail and goods orders. The man, a weathered old route trader named Bach, who had been making this trip since before Ronan had built the cabin, handed over the supply sack without meeting his eyes, which was unusual for Bach, and then said, with the expression of someone delivering news they'd have preferred to miss, "There's paper on you in town, and on your wife." Ronan looked at him. "Vaughn put it out," Bach said, "saying the lady was taken against her will, saying you're holding her under duress." He paused. The poster on you's got old charges on it, from the Garrick feud. Things from 10 years back. He shifted his weight. There's talk the territory marshal's involved, that a party might come up. Ronan thanked him. He paid for the supplies. He stood at the edge of the porch for a while after Bach's mule disappeared down the trail. Then he went inside. Evelyn was at the table with the ledger pages. She looked up when he came in, reading whatever was on his face before he said anything. "Tell me," she said. He told her. She didn't react the way he might have expected. No fear, no collapse. She set her pen down with a precise, deliberate movement and looked at the middle distance for a moment, the way she did when she was building something in her head. "He's moving faster than I thought," she said. "He doesn't have a choice," Ronan said. "We left with the documents. He knows we left with the documents, or he suspects it. The posters aren't about you. They're about making it impossible for us to use what we have. If we're criminals," she said slowly, "then anything we produce is testimony from criminals." "Yes." She looked at the papers on the table. Then she looked at him. "Then we need to move," she said. "We need to think first," he said. "Moving without a plan is how you get caught in the open." She held his gaze. "I agree." A pause. "But while we think, he's building a story about us. Every day we wait is another day his story gets more established." She touched the edge of the ledger page with one finger. "We need to be faster than his version of events." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "All right," he said. "Then let's think." Outside, the mountains rose patient and enormous above the cabin. Inside, in the lamplight, two people who had started as strangers and were becoming something neither had a word for, yet began building the thing they would need. Not a plan for survival, a plan for justice. The plan took 3 days to build and had holes in it they could both see. That was the honest version of it. The version Ronan kept in his head while Evelyn laid the papers across the table in a new arrangement. Ledger pages on the left, the unsigned letter in the center, the two remaining documents they'd been slowly deciphering on the right, was that every plan with holes was still better than no plan, and the holes were at least visible, which meant they could work around them. "The problem," Evelyn said, tapping the center letter, "is that none of this is signed. A judge, a real judge, a territorial judge, not one of Vaughn's people, would need provenance. He'd need to know where these came from and who handled them and why the chain of custody is trustworthy." "Which it isn't," Ronan said, "from a legal standpoint. Not yet." She sat back in her chair. "We need a witness, someone who is inside Vaughn's operation and can speak to what these numbers mean. Someone who can put names to what my father only put numbers to." "Someone who's still alive and willing to talk," Ronan said, "which narrows the field considerably." She looked at him. "You know Cartwell better than you let on." "I knew it once," he said. 10 years is a long time. But the bones of a town don't change that fast. The people who stay, stay. The ones who know the most are usually the ones who can't afford to leave." She paused. "Who did Vaughn use?" "Not his hired men. They don't know the books. Someone clerical. Someone who processed transactions without asking what they were." Ronan thought about this. There was a name that came forward reluctantly, the way names do when they're attached to complicated history. "Emmett Pollard," he said. "He was the bank's head clerk when I was last in town. Probably still is. Vaughn doesn't promote people. He keeps them useful and dependent." He paused. "Pollard was not a bad man. He was a frightened one. There's a difference." "Frightened men can be reached," Evelyn said. "Frightened men can also run directly to the person frightening them," Ronan said. "If we approach Pollard wrong, we give Vaughn everything he needs to know about what we have." She considered this. "Then we need to approach him right." "Which means in person," Ronan said. "Which means going back to Cartwell." The words sat between them for a moment. Cartwell, where there were wanted posters with their faces on them. Cartwell, where Vaughn had already demonstrated his willingness to move quickly and without restraint. "Not together," Evelyn said. "If we go together, we're visible. Two people matching the description on those posters traveling into town together. That's exactly what anyone watching for would notice." She was quiet for a moment, working through it. "I go alone. I know Pollard by sight. He came to the house several times with my father. He'd recognize me, which means he already knows who I am in this story, and I can use that. Or it means he reports you to Vaughn within the hour, Ronan said. Yes. She didn't flinch from it. That's the risk. He looked at her for a long moment. He'd learned, in the weeks they'd shared this space, that Evelyn Mercer's composure was not the composure of someone who wasn't afraid. It was the composure of someone who had decided that fear was a piece of information rather than a directive, and that distinguishing between the two was its own kind of skill. Not yet, he said. We don't go in until we know more about what's waiting there. She accepted this without argument, which told him she'd been thinking the same thing and was relieved he'd said it first. What they needed was intelligence, and intelligence required a source they could trust, and trust at this particular moment was a scarce resource. Bach came up the mountain the following Thursday. Ronan met him at the edge of the tree line before the old route trader reached the cabin, which was itself a message, a conversation out of Evelyn's earshot, which Ronan immediately reconsidered and abandoned when he heard her boots on the porch steps behind him. She had, evidently, been watching for Bach herself. I'll hear it, she said. Ronan didn't argue. Bach looked between them with the philosophical expression of a man who had been carrying other people's uncomfortable information between mountain settlements for 30 years and had developed a complete immunity to the drama of it. Town's been busy, Bach said. Marshal Dent rode in 4 days ago with 2 deputies. They've been staying at the Cartwell Inn, which Vaughn is paying for, which is the kind of thing people notice. He paused. The posters are on every building on Main Street now, and there's been talk from Vaughn's people, so take it as you like, that Miss Mercer was taken by force, that she's being held against her will in the mountains. What are people saying? Evelyn asked. Bach glanced at her. Divided. There are those who believe it because it's easier to believe it, and those who were in the chapel that morning and remember what they saw. He shifted the supply sack on his shoulder. The widow Hartley said publicly that she watched you speak your own vows, and that no woman under duress looks the way you looked. She got some trouble for saying it. What kind of trouble? Ronan asked. Vaughn's men had words with her son. The boy works at the mill. Bach's voice was neutral. He kept his job, but the widow stopped talking. Evelyn absorbed this quietly. Ronan watched her jaw tighten once and then deliberately release. Pollard, Ronan said to Bach. The bank clerk. How is he? Bach's expression shifted, something cautious entering it. Why do you ask about Pollard? Because I need to know. The old trader was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountain trail below, as if he was considering whether to be somewhere else. Then, Pollard's been sick, 3 weeks now. He's not at the bank. His wife told Meg Harper at the dry goods that it came on sudden. Fever that won't break. He paused. People are not connecting this to anything, but people are also not saying things in Cartwell right now that they might have said 6 months ago. Ronan heard the weight underneath this information and felt something cold move through his thinking. Fever. Coming on sudden, not connected to anything. He looked at Evelyn. Her face had gone very still. Is he alive? She asked. As of Monday, Bach said. Whether he stays that way. He shrugged. Not callously, just honestly. His wife is scared. That much is clear. After Bach had gone, they stood at the edge of the porch in the late afternoon light, the mountains above them showing the first gray fingers of approaching weather. My father, Evelyn said. Not as a question. We don't know, Ronan said. We know enough. Her voice was flat, not with absence of feeling, but with the specific flatness of someone pressing feeling down hard because the moment requires it. If Pollard was going to talk, if he'd been building toward it, if my father had involved him in whatever he was documenting, then Vaughn would have known. And Vaughn's method, apparently, is fever. If it's intentional, it requires someone with access and knowledge, Ronan said. That's a significant capability. It's not just muscle. He owns the doctor too, Evelyn said. Dr. Marsh. He took a loan from Vaughn's bank 3 years ago. Significant amount. It's in the ledger, I saw the account. She paused. An account that also shows the loan has never been called in. Not once. No payments, no interest accrued. The implications were not subtle. We can't wait, she said. If Pollard dies, we lose the testimony we'd need. We lose the one person who might be able to give context to what my father documented. She turned to face him. And if Vaughn is doing what we think he's doing, if these aren't natural deaths, then waiting is not safe. For us or for anyone else who knows something. Ronan leaned against the porch post and looked out at the tree line. The weather coming in from the northwest had a winter smell. Sharp, clean, without mercy. "We need to reach Pollard before Vaughn does," he said, "or before Vaughn finishes whatever's already been started." "Yes. That means someone gets into Cartwell and gets to him without Vaughn's people knowing." He paused. "The marshal and his deputies are watching for us. The posters are up. We go in as ourselves. We don't make it to Pollard's house." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then, "I don't need to go in as myself." He looked at her. "I need to go in as someone unremarkable," she said. "Someone who matches no part of the description on that poster. The poster shows Evelyn Mercer, my father's daughter, the debtor's girl. Everyone in that town knows what Evelyn Mercer looks like." She paused. "But a woman coming in from the eastern settlements to sell dried goods and visit her cousin. That's a different woman entirely." "You'd need a cover that holds under questioning," Ronan said. "If one of Vaughn's men recognizes you, then I handle it." She met his eyes. "I'm not asking for a guarantee. I'm asking whether the plan is viable." He thought about it. The eastern trail into Cartwell came in from the opposite direction of the mountain road. It was used by small traders and settlers from the far valley, people who moved through Cartwell without connection to its primary social web. A woman traveling alone on that route would attract notice, but routine notice, not the alarmed scrutiny of someone looking for a fugitive. "You'd need to change how you look," he said, not dramatically, but enough. "I know." She touched the side of her face briefly, a gesture that might have been about her hair or her appearance, or simply about the strangeness of the conversation. "I can do that." "And you'd need a reason to be in the Pollard house specifically," he said. "You can't just walk up and knock." She thought for a moment. "His wife. She's buying goods in quantity for someone who's sick and can't leave the house. I'll bring something that a woman caring for a bedridden husband would actually need." She opens the door. "I tell her who I am and why I'm there before she can close it. And if she panics? Then I make a very fast argument." She paused. "I'm persuasive when the stakes are sufficient." Ronan studied her. "I know," he said. There was a silence that was different from their usual working silences, a fraction warmer, a fraction more complicated. Neither of them acknowledged it directly, which was consistent with how they'd been handling the growing number of such moments. "You'll need me in the town," he said. "Not visible, but close enough that if something goes wrong—" "Yes," she said, before he finished. "I was going to ask." He nodded. 2 days to prepare. Then we go." She went back inside. He stayed on the porch for another few minutes, watching the weather move in from the northwest, thinking about the specific math of what they were about to attempt, the variables that could be controlled and the ones that couldn't, the distance between their plan and the thing that would actually happen when it made contact with reality. He'd been in enough situations that required this kind of calculation to know that the math never came out clean. You planned to the edges of what you could know, and then you held the center. The only question was whether the center held. He went inside. They spent the next 2 days with focused, practical intent. Evelyn reorganized the papers into a condensed packet. The most critical ledger pages, the unsigned letter, a handwritten summary she had composed in her neat, precise script that translated the numerical evidence into plain language a judge who wasn't an accountant could follow. She wrapped this in oilcloth and sealed it, and she and Ronan discussed at length where it should be kept and how it should be transported. Ronan, in parallel, worked through the practical logistics of entry and concealment. He knew Cartwell's layout, not the current layout, but the bones of it, the alleys and the buildings and the basic geography that didn't change when a man spent a decade in the mountains. He'd ridden through it twice in the past years on supply runs, always in and out fast, head down, trading on the assumption that enough time had passed that faces faded. The assumption had served him. He didn't intend to be generous with it. He also spent time alone, checking and rechecking the rifle and the revolver he kept cleaned and ready, running through the precise mechanics of each with the care of someone who understood that a weapon failing at the wrong moment was not an abstraction. On the evening of the second day, he found Evelyn at the table with the small oilcloth packet in front of her, not working, just sitting. The lamp was lit but turned low. Outside, the weather that had been building had arrived. A cold rain, soft and steady, the kind that could last 3 days or stop by morning. "You're thinking about your father," he said. She looked up. "I'm thinking about whether I'm doing this for the right reasons." He sat down. "What are the options?" "Justice, like I said." She paused. "Or anger dressed up as justice." She looked at the packet. "There's a version of this where I convince myself I'm doing something principled, and what I'm actually doing is wanting him to suffer. Vaughn." She said the name plainly. "And I'm not certain those two things aren't sometimes the same thing." "They're not always the same," Ronan said, "but they're not always different either." She looked at him. "Is that how it was for you, in the Garrick feud?" He was quiet for a moment. This was territory he hadn't offered, and she hadn't pressed before now. "I told myself it was about survival," he said. "And it was, partly. But by the end, I wasn't surviving anymore. I was fighting because I'd been fighting, and I didn't know how to stop." He looked at his hands on the table. Large hands, scarred in places, the hands of someone who'd used them for things they couldn't be taken back from. "The men I killed, some of them deserved consequences. Not all of them deserved what they got." He paused. "That's the difference. Justice has limits. Anger doesn't." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. There was something in her expression he hadn't seen before, or had seen but hadn't named, a kind of careful attention, the way you look at something you're deciding how much to trust. "How do you know?" she said slowly, "when you've crossed the line?" "Usually," he said, "you know after." She exhaled. Something in her shoulders that had been held at a particular tension released slightly. "I don't want him to suffer," she said. "I want him to be unable to do this again. To the next accountant who asks too many questions. To the next woman who inherits the wrong kind of debt." She paused. "If that's anger, it's at least pointed at something useful." "That's not anger," Ronan said. "That's the right reason." She looked at him for a moment longer, and then she picked up the oilcloth packet and turned it over in her hands once, like she was testing its weight. "Get some sleep," he said. "We leave before first light." She did. He didn't for a while. He sat by the fire with the revolver broken open on the table in front of him, cleaning it with the methodical attention of a man putting his mind somewhere quiet, and listening to the rain work its way through the pine canopy above the cabin. They left before dawn, as planned. The rain had stopped in the night and left the trail clean and cold, the pine needles pressed flat, every surface glittering faintly in the pre-dawn dark. Evelyn was dressed in the clothes they'd worked out, plain wool, practical, the kind worn by a woman who worked with her hands. Her hair was different, pulled back differently, and she'd done something subtle to the way she carried herself that Ronan noticed but couldn't quantify. She seemed slightly shorter, slightly rounder in her movements, less the woman who split firewood with precise mechanics, and more the woman who sold dried goods and had a cousin in Cartwell. "It's good," he said, looking at her in the early light. "Don't be encouraging," she said. "It makes me nervous." "Then it's acceptable," he said. "Better?" "Marginally." They parted ways at the Eastern Fork, 2 miles above the valley. He took the high route, the one that came down behind the livery stable and gave access to the alley network he'd mapped from memory. She took the Eastern Trail, moving at the pace of a trader, the canvas bag with the herbs and tinctures they'd assembled over her shoulder. The distance between them, as he watched her figure disappear around the curve of the Eastern Trail, was the kind of distance that had physical weight. He turned up the high route and kept moving. Cartwell in the morning was a different creature than Cartwell on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of a marriage auction. It was quieter, more deliberate, the kind of town that came awake slowly and with the particular purposefulness of a place that had learned not to attract attention to itself. Ronan came in behind the livery stable, which smelled exactly as he remembered, and stood in the shadow of the building for long enough to map the movement on the visible section of Main Street. 2 men he didn't recognize were positioned at the far end, the posture of men who weren't there for any particular reason, which meant they were there for every particular reason. Vaughn's people, or Dent's deputies, or both. He moved through the alley behind the hardware store and came out briefly onto the side street, long enough to confirm the layout of the blocks near Pollard's house, then pulled back before anyone moving on Main could pick him out. Emmett Pollard's house was on the residential street 1 block north of the Main. A modest place, white paint going gray. A small kitchen garden at the side that had been left unattended long enough to show it. A lamp burned in the front window even at this hour, which was the lamp of a house where someone was sick and time had lost its normal shape. He couldn't see Evelyn yet. He didn't expect to. She would have come in from the East End and would be approaching from a different angle. He waited, which was something he was able to do with more patience than most. The waiting was not comfortable, but it was familiar. The specific alertness of a man who has learned that most failures come from moving before the moment is right. He had been in position for approximately 30 minutes when he heard voices on the residential street. A woman's voice, not raised. The particular cadence of someone speaking with deliberate calm to a person who is about to do something alarmed. Then a door. Then silence. He exhaled slowly. Inside the Pollard house, Evelyn had approximately 10 minutes before a neighbor noticed. Before Mrs. Pollard made a decision she hadn't yet made. Before the window on this entire attempt closed. He could not help with any of that. That was hers. He watched the street. A dog crossed at the far end. A woman with a basket came out of the house 2 doors down, looked at nothing in particular, went back inside. On Main Street, just visible at the corner, one of the men he'd clocked earlier shifted position and said something to another man Ronan hadn't seen until now. 3 of them. On the Main Street alone. He adjusted his count of the variables. When the Pollard front door opened 12 minutes later and Evelyn came out, she was walking at the exact pace she'd gone in. Unhurried, the canvas bag still over her shoulder, nothing visibly different about her. She turned left, away from Main Street, toward the eastern exit. She didn't look in his direction. He gave her a 4-minute lead, then took the back alley route to the high trail. She was waiting at the eastern fork with the mule, her face composed and wind-bitten, the canvas bag now lighter by whatever she'd left at Pollard's house. "Tell me," he said. "He's alive," she said. "Barely. He looks—" She paused, choosing. "He looks like a man who knows he's not going to get better and has made his peace with it." She reached into the inside of her coat and produced a folded piece of paper. He couldn't speak much without coughing, but he could write. Ronan took the paper. It was not long. Pollard's handwriting was shaky, the letters uneven, the kind of writing produced by a man whose hands didn't obey him reliably. But the content was clear. Names, dates, specific account numbers, and the transactions associated with them, in the shorthand of someone who had worked with these figures long enough to carry them in his head. And at the bottom, in handwriting slightly more controlled than the rest, as though he'd steadied himself for it. She asked if this helps. "It helps. The Mercer girl's father was a good man. I should have said so when it mattered." Ronan read it twice. He looked up at Evelyn. She was watching the mountain trail, not him, with the expression of someone carrying something heavy and in no need of assistance with it. "His wife?" Ronan asked. "She cried," Evelyn said simply. "I told her what I could without telling her what I couldn't. She knows something is wrong with him that isn't natural. She's known for a while." A pause. "She gave me the herbs back, said she didn't need payment." A shorter pause. "I left them anyway." He folded Pollard's paper and put it inside his coat alongside the oilcloth packet, the 2 documents now pressed together in the dark against his ribs. They rode back up into the Blackstones without speaking for a long time, the mountain rising around them, the morning light moving across the granite and pine in the particular way it had up here, austere, without warmth, but honest. "Will he make it?" Ronan asked, when they were high enough that the valley had disappeared behind them. "I don't know," Evelyn said. He left it there. Some questions didn't require further excavation. Back at the cabin, they spread everything across the table again. The ledger pages, the unsigned letter, Evelyn's handwritten summary, and now Pollard's shaky, invaluable testimony, and looked at what they had. "It's enough," Evelyn said. "It's close to enough," Ronan said. "For a territorial judge, someone outside Vaughn's reach, this is provable." She touched each document in sequence. The ledger shows the pattern. The letter names the method. Pollard's statement puts a living witness to the account numbers. She paused. "A judge who looks at this and doesn't act is a judge who's already been bought, and there's nothing more we can do about that." "There's one judge in the territory who isn't Vaughn's," Ronan said. "Wesley Kane. He's out of Fort Halloran, 2 days' ride south. He's known for being difficult." He paused, "which in this case means honest." "Then we need to get this to him. We need to get this to him in a way that doesn't result in us being arrested by Dent's deputies before we reach him. Ronan leaned back in his chair. Dent's been in Cartwell for days. If he has a warrant, a real one based on the kidnapping story, he has legal authority to detain us, even if we're carrying evidence. Even innocent people carrying evidence can be silenced if the right hands get hold of them first, Evelyn said. She said it without bitterness, simply as a fact of how the world operated. Yes. She was quiet, looking at the table. Then, so we need a way into Fort Halloran that bypasses Dent, and we need to move before Vaughn makes his next move. He's going to make a move, Ronan said. The posters haven't produced us. Pollard's... He paused. If Pollard dies and doesn't produce a deathbed accusation, Vaughn might feel secured for a while. But if he suspects we made contact, he'll accelerate, Evelyn finished. Yes. She looked at the oilcloth packet in Pollard's paper. Then we don't wait for him to accelerate, she said. We go to Kane first. The fire was burning low. Outside, the sun had moved past noon and was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, the shadows lengthening across the clearing in the slow, indifferent way of mountain afternoons. We'll need to prepare, Ronan said. Supplies for the ride south. The route through the back ridges avoids Cartwell and the main road, but it's rough country and it's longer. How much longer? 3 days instead of 2, she nodded. Then we start preparing tonight. Ronan looked at her across the table, across the papers that represented everything they'd built toward, across the distance that had been measured in weeks of early mornings and rifle practice and evenings by the fire, and the particular, unremarked accumulation of a shared life that neither of them had expected when any of this began. She was not the woman who'd stood at that altar with white-knuckled hands and a fixed stare. She was still precise, still composed, still carried her feelings as information rather than performance. But there was something in the way she occupied the cabin now, the way she moved through the day. A settledness, a quality of being present rather than enduring. That was different from the first weeks. He wasn't sure what she saw when she looked at him. He hadn't asked. Haley, she said. He blinked, pulled back from where he'd been. Yeah. Thank you, she said. For today. For... She stopped, started again, with the precision of someone who says what they mean, and not more than they mean. For all of it. He looked at her for a moment. Don't thank me yet, he said. We haven't finished. No, she said, but I wanted to say it while the opportunity was present. She held his gaze for a moment longer than their usual exchanges required, and then she looked down at the table and began organizing the documents for travel. He got up and went to start on the supplies. Outside the mountain held the evening light, and the pines moved in the late wind, and somewhere below in the valley, Cartwell continued its careful business of not saying what it knew. But up here, in the lamplit cabin above the tree line, 2 people who had begun as an accident of desperation were becoming something that didn't have a name yet, but was taking the shape of one. The journey south would start at dawn. They left at dawn as planned, which in practice meant they left 40 minutes after dawn because the mule had developed an opinion about the cold and required negotiation. Evelyn handled it with the matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to everything that resisted her. Not anger, not pleading, just a sequence of increasingly direct persuasions until the animal concluded that cooperation was the path of least resistance. Ronan watched this from the corner of his eye while he secured the saddlebags and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say, and because he'd learned that Evelyn Mercer had a particular dislike for commentary on how she solved problems. The back ridge route south was everything he'd promised. Rough, longer than the direct road, and ungenerous in its terrain. It climbed through 2 high passes before descending toward the southern valley, the kind of country that didn't acknowledge the existence of comfortable travel. The trail in places was barely a trail, more the memory of previous passage than anything intentional, marked by the occasional cairn and the compressed earth of hooves that had come through once or twice in the last year. But it was empty. That was the thing it had going for it. They rode 3 hours without seeing another person, which was exactly the kind of solitude that felt like a resource rather than loneliness. Tell me about Kane, Evelyn said, when they'd cleared the first pass and the trail widened enough to ride alongside each other. Ronan considered what he actually knew versus what he'd heard. He came to Fort Halloran about 6 years ago. Before that, he was a circuit judge in the Eastern Territories, what had a reputation for being rigorous, not popular with land speculators or men with political connections. He paused. I never met him personally. What I know comes from Bach mostly, and from a man named Greer who passed through the mountains 2 winters back and had just come from Fort Halloran. What did Greer say? That Kane had twice refused writs that the territorial governor wanted pushed through, that he'd held up a land grant that had money behind it for 8 months while he investigated the title claims. Ronan glanced at her. That he was old, difficult, had no patience for people who wasted his time, and was the closest thing to an honest official the territory had left. Old and difficult, Evelyn said. At least we know what we're walking into. He might refuse to see us. The warrants on our names give him cause. Then we make the case that what we're carrying outweighs the warrants. She adjusted the oilcloth packet inside her coat. We don't have the luxury of a warm reception. We just have to be more persuasive than the alternative. The second day of the ride was harder than the first. The backridge route dropped through a section of broken country where the trail crossed and recrossed a half-frozen creek, and the footing was uncertain enough that they moved slowly, leading the animals in places rather than riding. By mid-afternoon, Evelyn's boots had been wet for 2 hours, and the temperature was dropping toward something serious. They made camp in a shallow overhang of granite that blocked the wind from the northwest. Not comfortable, but sufficient. Ronan built a fire deep enough under the overhang that its light wasn't visible from any distance. A habit from the years when being found at night had been a thing to prevent. Evelyn wrung out her socks over the fire with the practical stoicism of someone who had accepted that discomfort was part of the current arrangement and was managing it rather than discussing it. The sock wringing, he had come to understand, was a reliable indicator of her mood. When she was genuinely troubled, she went still and quiet. But when she was merely uncomfortable, she dealt with it with a kind of focused practicality that was almost, though he would not have said this out loud, endearing. When we get to Kane, she said, spreading the sock near the fire, I should present the evidence. He looked at her. Not because you can't, she said, because I'm the one who can explain the accounting. The ledger patterns. I've spent weeks with those numbers. I understand what they mean in a way that a judge will need explained by someone who can answer questions about them. She paused. You understand the context, what Vaughn is, what the power structure in Cartwell looks like, what the violence behind it represents. We both need to speak. I wasn't planning to send you in alone, he said. I know. She looked at the fire. I just wanted it said. What I'll do and what you'll do. All right, he said. You take the documents. I take the context. Yes. She looked at the sock, determined it was approximately dry enough, and put it back on with a small wince at the residual damp. And if Kane asks about the warrants, we don't lie, Ronan said, about anything. The moment we start managing the story, we become exactly what Vaughn has said we are. She looked at him, including the Garrick feud. The fire snapped between them. If he asks, Ronan said. Yes. She held his gaze for a moment. There was no pity in her expression, which he was grateful for. Just the level attention she brought to things she was deciding how to hold. All right, she said. Then, after a pause, for what it's worth, what I know of the Garrick feud is what gets told in town. I don't take town stories as fact. He looked at the fire. Some of it's fact. Most stories are, she said. The question is which parts. She pulled her blanket around her shoulders. And I've noticed you don't volunteer information about yourself, which means whatever happened is something you've thought about long enough to know it's complicated. He didn't answer immediately. The fire was doing what fires do, pulling the attention toward it, creating the particular intimacy of shared warmth in cold air. The Garrick family claimed land that had been my family's for 20 years, he said. It started as a legal dispute, became something else. He paused. By the time it ended, there were 6 men dead. 2 of them were mine. The other 4... He stopped. The other 4 are the part that followed me into the mountains. Evelyn was quiet. I'm not asking for your judgment on it, he said. I'm not offering one, she said. I'm listening. Which was, he'd found, one of the things she was best at. The quality of her listening was different from most people's. It wasn't waiting for a gap to say the next thing. It was actual attention, the kind that didn't require him to explain everything or fill in the silences. I told myself at the time it was necessary, he said, that the situation had moved past the point where restraint was survivable. He looked at his hands. I've had 10 years to think about whether that was true, and my honest conclusion is that it was true for 2 of them and not for the other 2. He paused. That's the part I carry. The wind moved outside the overhang. The horses shifted. The fire burned. That's honest, Evelyn said. It's what I have, he said. She didn't say anything further, and he didn't need her to. She moved her blanket slightly, not toward him, not that, but in the adjusting way of someone getting comfortable. And they sat in the fire's company for a while before the cold and the long day's riding made sleep unavoidable. He woke twice in the night. Both times she was already awake on the second wake, sitting up with her knees drawn to her chest, watching the dead fire's embers. Sleep, he said. I know, she said. But she was quiet for a while after that. They reached Fort Halloran on the afternoon of the 3rd day, coming in from the northwest on a road that was actual road, graded, marked, the kind of infrastructure that announced a settlement of some permanence. Fort Halloran was larger than Cartwell. It had been a military outpost once, the old walls of the original structure still visible in the town's eastern quarter. The rest of it grown up around that history in the way of towns that outlast their original purpose. There was a main street with proper storefronts, a hotel, 2 saloons, a territorial office with a flag out front, and near the center, set back from the main street on its own lot, the low stone building that served as the judge's chambers and residence. They tied up outside the building and stood for a moment on the street, both of them aware of the quality of the moment, the days of riding, the cold, the documents inside the coat, and the door in front of them that would either open or not. However this goes, Evelyn said. Yeah, Ronan said. She straightened her coat, touched the oilcloth packet once, and went up the steps. The clerk inside the front room was young, bespectacled, and possessed of the protective wariness of someone whose job involved screening people the judge didn't want to see. We need to see Judge Kane, Evelyn said. The judge isn't available without an appointment. Tell him we have evidence of murder and financial fraud involving a Cartwell banker named Cedric Vaughn, Evelyn said, and that his head clerk is currently dying of what appears to be a suspicious fever, and that if the judge doesn't see us today, the evidence goes with us, and the next death that follows will be at least partially his responsibility for the delay. The clerk stared at her. Please, she added. The clerk went through the interior door with the urgency of someone who had just become responsible for a decision above his pay grade. They waited 7 minutes. Then the clerk came back. He'll see you, the clerk said, with the expression of a man who is relieved to have transferred the problem upward. Judge Wesley Kane was older than Ronan had expected. Not just old, but worn, the kind of worn that comes from decades of work that required him to hold things other people left at his door. He was seated behind a desk that was buried under papers, and he looked at them over a pair of glasses with the specific assessment of a man who had spent a career determining who was telling the truth and who was managing it. Sit down, he said. Not warmly, but not hostilely either, the neutral tone of a man who reserved judgment for after the evidence. They sat. I know who you are, Kane said. There's a warrant out of Cartwell with both your names on it. I want you to know I'm aware of that before you say anything. We know about the warrant, Ronan said. We're not here to deny it or run from it. We're here because what we're carrying is more important than what Marshal Dent thinks he has on us. Kane looked at him for a moment, then at Evelyn. The warrant says the woman was taken against her will. The woman, Evelyn said with careful precision, spoke her own vows in front of a chapel full of witnesses and has been building a case against Cedric Vaughn for the past several weeks. The warrant is a tool Vaughn is using to discredit us before we could reach you. Kane was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. Show me what you have. Evelyn laid the documents on his desk one by one, explaining each as she placed it. She did this with the composure and clarity of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her head many times during 3 days of cold riding. Not a performance, but the focused delivery of information to someone capable of understanding it. She walked Kane through the ledger patterns, the circled columns, her father's marginal notes. She explained the unsigned letter and what its oblique language described directly. She presented Pollard's testimony, the shaky handwriting, the account numbers, the last line about her father being a good man. Kane read everything twice. He asked questions, Pointed, specific questions that indicated he understood accounting and law and the specific ways powerful men concealed both. And Evelyn answered each one without hedging. Ronan spoke once, when Kane asked about the property acquisitions named in the unsigned letter. He named 3 families he knew of from Cartwell's history who had lost land to Vaughn's bank under circumstances that had never sat right with the people who'd observed them, and who had died beforehand in ways that were accepted at the time as natural. Kane listened to all of this without expression. When they finished, he was quiet for a long time, long enough that the clerk outside could be heard moving papers, and somewhere in the building a clock ticked through the silence. "The unsigned letter is a problem," Kane said finally. "Without authorship, it's circumstantial. A good defense attorney picks it apart in an hour." "That's why we need it together with the ledger and Pollard's testimony," Evelyn said. "Separately, each piece is arguable. Together, they describe a pattern of conduct that—" "I know what they describe together," Kane said. He wasn't cutting her off. His tone was the sharp efficiency of a man thinking out loud. "What I'm telling you is the legal challenge you're handing me." He looked at the unsigned letter. "Who sent this?" "We don't know," Evelyn said. "We found it hidden in the cabin." Kane looked up. "Hidden where?" "In the cabin walls," Ronan said. "Behind a false section of chinking near the north wall. We found it when—" He paused, because this was the part of the story he hadn't yet told anyone. The part that had come 2 nights after the Pollard visit, when Evelyn had noticed a section of the cabin wall that didn't match its surroundings in texture, and they'd spent an hour finding the seam. "When we were looking for something else," Kane suggested. "When the wall didn't look right," Ronan said. Kane studied him. "How long have you been in that cabin?" 10 years. "And you didn't find this." "It was well hidden," Ronan said, "and I wasn't looking." A pause. "I was trying not to know things about Cartwell." Something shifted in Kane's expression. Not softness exactly, but a fractional reduction in the professional distance he'd been maintaining. He looked at the unsigned letter again. "This was written by someone with detailed knowledge of Vaughn's operations," he said. "Someone who was inside or adjacent. Someone who was afraid but wanted a record to exist somewhere." He tapped the paper. "Someone who chose your cabin specifically, which means someone who trusted you, Hale. Or trusted that a man outside the law might eventually have cause to use what they left." Ronan hadn't considered this framing. He considered it now, and it landed with a weight he hadn't expected. That someone, years ago, had looked at the mountain exile and decided he was the right repository for a truth they couldn't carry alone. "Bach," he said. Evelyn turned to look at him. "The rote trader," Ronan said. "He comes to the cabin twice a month, has for years. He knows every building on that road better than the people who own them." He paused. "And he's been feeding us information about Cartwell since the posters went up, without being asked, without payment." Kane looked at him steadily. "Can you reach this man?" "Yes." "Then I want him here." Kane stood, with the deliberateness of someone whose joints had opinions about standing but who didn't let them vote. "I want his testimony, not written, in person, under oath." He looked at the documents laid across his desk. "What you've brought me today is enough to begin an investigation. It is not yet enough to arrest a man with Vaughn's resources and connections without having that arrest held up in challenge for 2 years while he operates freely." He paused. "I need the author of that letter, and I need Pollard, if he lives." "Pollard may not live," Evelyn said. Her voice was even. "We believe Vaughn is responsible for his illness." Kane looked at her for a moment. "Then I need a physician's examination of Pollard before he dies. An independent one." He moved to the door, opened it, spoke to the clerk. "Send for Dr. Ansell. Tell him it's a court matter." Then he turned back. "Dr. Ansell is not connected to Cartwell or to Vaughn. He's done forensic work for this court before." He looked at both of them. "I need 2 days to prepare the proper writs. The warrant on you both. I'm suspending it as of this afternoon. Pending investigation. Dent will not be pleased." "Dennis staying in a hotel Vaughn is paying for," Ronan said. Kane's expression didn't change. "I'm aware of where Dent is staying." The tone carried an entire paragraph's worth of opinion compressed into 8 words. 2 days. "Can you stay in Fort Halloran?" "We can." Evelyn said. Don't go back to Cartwell, Kane said. Don't send word there. If Vaughn suspects you've reached me, he'll move to destroy whatever evidence is still accessible. He paused. Including potentially Pollard. He didn't need to elaborate. They found a room at the Fort Halloran Hotel. A single room, which was both economically practical and the kind of situation that required a brief, matter-of-fact negotiation that they conducted in the hallway with the efficiency of people who had run out of patience for unnecessary discomfort. I'll take the floor, Ronan said. There are 2 beds, Evelyn said. He looked into the room. There were technically 2 beds. Narrow ones, the kind the frontier produced in hotels where square footage was money, pressed against opposite walls with perhaps 4 feet between them. Then we each take one, she said, as if the conversation was resolved, and went inside. He went in after her, and they did not discuss it further, which was the right call. The 2 days in Fort Halloran were tense in the particular way of enforced inactivity when the thing you've been working toward is now in someone else's hands and moving at someone else's pace. Evelyn spent them organizing her notes, rewriting the summary she'd prepared, anticipating the questions Kane might ask, and preparing cleaner answers. Ronan spent them watching the street from the hotel window with the methodical attention of someone who understood that Vaughn had people in more places than Cartwell. On the second afternoon, Bach arrived. He came up the Fort Halloran Main Street on his mule with the expression of someone who had been expecting a summons and had already decided to answer it. He found Ronan outside the hotel, and he stopped his mule and sat on it for a moment, looking at Ronan with something in his eyes that was between relief and the specific discomfort of a man who has been carrying a thing alone for a long time. It was you, Ronan said. Bach was quiet for a moment. I found the papers in a dead man's effect, he said. A bank clerk name of Garland who died on the South Road 3 years ago. Hart, they said. He paused. The way his things were scattered, it wasn't Hart. He'd been running. He looked at his mule's ears. He had no family I could find. The papers were addressed to no one, but they mentioned the Hale cabin by description. He paused again, longer. I thought, if anything ever pushed you back into the world, you'd have something to bring with you. Ronan looked at the old trader for a long moment. You could have told me, he said. You weren't ready to be told, Bach said. Not unkindly. And neither was the situation. Kane's examination of Bach took 3 hours. Dr. Ansell had ridden to Cartwell with a territorial court order and a deputy, and had performed his examination of Emmett Pollard, who was alive, but, in the doctor's professional assessment, declining in ways inconsistent with natural fever. Trace evidence of a substance that Ansell identified carefully and documented in writing, consistent with deliberate poisoning through a compound available through a medical practice. Dr. Marsh's medical practice. The report came back to Kane on the morning of the 3rd day, and when Ronan and Evelyn were called to the judge's chambers, Kane was standing rather than sitting, which seemed significant. I have enough, Kane said. The words landed in the room with a weight that was different from anything said in the previous days, simpler, more absolute. I have enough to issue arrest warrants for Cedric Vaughn on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit murder, and a separate warrant for Dr. Marsh as a material participant. He looked at both of them over his glasses. The warrants will be served by territorial deputies, not Dent, not anyone connected to Cartwell's current administration. I'm sending 4 men. Vaughn has hired men, Ronan said, armed ones. If they resist, that's why I'm sending 4, Kane said. And that's why I'm telling you both now before it happens, so that you understand clearly you are not to return to Cartwell before the arrest is completed. He looked at Ronan specifically. You understand what I'm saying. You're saying don't go in guns up while your men are trying to serve a legal warrant, Ronan said. I'm saying exactly that. Kane held his gaze. Whatever history you have with violence, and I'm not asking you to account for it today, I need this done through law. If it's done through law, it holds. If it's done through force, Vaughn's attorneys have their argument, and this falls apart. He paused. Can you give me that? Ronan was quiet for a moment. Evelyn, beside him, said nothing, but he was aware of her awareness of his answer. Yes, Ronan said. Kane nodded. The arrest party leaves at first light tomorrow. They were back in the room at the hotel by mid-afternoon. Evelyn sat on the edge of the narrow bed facing the window, looking at the street below with the expression she wore when something large was settling through her thinking. "It's actually happening," she said. "Close to it," Ronan said. "Close," she agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "Do you trust Kane?" "I trust that he's self-interested in the right direction," Ronan said. "An honest judge who lets a case like this collapse under him loses the only thing that makes him what he is. That's a very practical kind of trust. It's the only kind that holds under pressure," he said. She turned to look at him. The afternoon light was coming through the window at a low angle, the way it did in late season, and it caught the edge of her face in a way that made her look tired and honest, and nothing like the woman on the poster that Vaughn had placed on every building in Cartwell. "I keep thinking about my father," she said, "about what he would say if he knew where we are right now, what we'd put together." "What do you think he'd say?" She smiled. Not broadly, not warmly, but the specific small smile of someone accessing a private truth. "He'd say the accounting is solid and the testimony is sufficient, but he'd worry about whether the judge could be trusted." She paused. "And then he'd ask if I'd eaten." Ronan looked at her for a moment. "Had you?" "This morning," she said. "Barely." He stood. "There's a place on the main street that looked like it had something hot on the stove." She looked up at him. "You're hungry?" "You're hungry," he said. "I'm practical." She stood, and there was a moment, brief, unremarked, neither of them acknowledging it, where the distance between them was smaller than usual and neither moved to correct it. Then she picked up her coat and went to the door. "Practical," she said, not looking back at him, but with something in the word that wasn't entirely argument. He followed her out, and they went down the Fort Halloran Main Street in the early evening. Two people who had ridden 3 days through rough country carrying evidence of a dead man's accounting and a dying man's testimony, who were about to watch the law attempt something that might work or might not, and who were, in the middle of all of it, going to find somewhere warm to eat. The arrest party left Fort Halloran at first light. Ronan and Evelyn watched them go from the hotel porch. 4 territorial deputies on good horses, well-armed, carrying the warrants in a sealed case, moving south toward the main road that would take them to Cartwell. They watched until the riders disappeared around the bend in the Fort Halloran Road, and then they stood for a moment in the cold morning air, and the town around them went about its business with no particular awareness of what was riding toward a valley 2 days south. "Now we wait," Evelyn said. "Now we wait," Ronan said. She exhaled, a long, slow breath that turned white in the cold air and then dispersed. Waiting, he knew, was its own kind of hardship. The days of movement and purpose had given them structure, given them a problem with edges and a direction to push against. Waiting returned them to uncertainty, to the space where control ended and consequence began. But they had done what they could do. The rest was in Kane's hands, and in the law, and in the stubborn, imperfect machinery of justice that ground slowly and sometimes failed and sometimes, against the considerable weight of money and power and carefully maintained fear, sometimes didn't. He went inside to make coffee. She came in after him and sat at the small table near the window, and opened the notebook she'd been carrying since the cabin, and began writing. Not the documents anymore, not the summary for Kane, but something else, in a smaller, more personal hand. He didn't ask what it was. He set a cup on the table beside her and went to watch the street. Outside, Fort Halloran moved through its morning. A dog crossed the road. A woman hung washing on a line strung between 2 posts despite the cold. A wagon came in from the east with its load covered in canvas, the driver hunched against the wind. Ordinary things. The ordinary world continuing its ordinary motion while something extraordinary either succeeded or failed 2 days south of where they stood. Ronan's hand rested on the window frame, and he thought about Cartwell, about the people in it who had watched and said nothing, and the ones who had spoken and paid for it, and the widow Hartley who had told the truth and been made to stop, and Emmett Pollard in his bed with his shaky handwriting and his 11 final words about a good man. He thought about what Kane had said, that if it was done through law, it held. He wanted to believe that. He was working on believing that. The coffee steamed in his hand. Behind him, Evelyn wrote. Outside, the morning continued its cold, indifferent work. The wait began. The waiting lasted 4 days, which was 2 days longer than it should have taken, and long enough that Ronan had mapped every visible section of Fort Halloran's main street from the hotel window, and Evelyn had filled 16 pages of her notebook with writing he still hadn't asked about. On the morning of the fourth day, one of Kane's deputies rode back in alone and fast, which was neither of the things the return of the arrest party was supposed to look like. Ronan was off the porch and at the hitching post before the man had fully stopped his horse. "What happened?" he said. The deputy, young, travel-worn, with the expression of someone who had been carrying news for 2 days and was relieved to finally hand it to someone, caught his breath and said, "Vaughn ran. Night before we arrived. Someone warned him." The words landed with the specific weight of a plan encountering the thing it hadn't accounted for. "Where?" Ronan said. "We don't know. His house was cleared, personal items, cash reserves from the bank's safe, 2 horses from his stable. Gone." The deputy dismounted stiffly. "But his men didn't run. 3 of them were still at the bank when we arrived, and they didn't cooperate peacefully." He paused. "Nobody killed. 2 of ours took minor injuries. All 3 of his men are in custody." Evelyn had come off the porch. She stood beside Ronan now, listening. "And Marsh?" she asked. "The doctor was at his office. He didn't run." The deputy looked at her. "He also didn't resist. He had the look of a man who'd been expecting this for some time and had decided that resistance wasn't worth the additional weight." He paused. "He's talking, apparently quite a lot." Ronan absorbed all of this. Vaughn was gone. The mechanism was in custody and cooperating, but the man at the center of it had been warned and had moved faster than the law. Someone in Fort Halloran, or between Fort Halloran and Cartwell, had sent word ahead. He looked at Evelyn. She was already thinking the same thing. He could see it in the way her eyes had gone to the middle distance, the working expression, the internal cartography of the problem being redrawn around the new shape of things. "Dent," she said. "Possibly," Ronan said, "or someone in Kane's office who didn't need to be. Dent had 2 days' warning," she said. "He knew the arrest party was coming. He's been in Cartwell the entire time." They went to Kane together. The judge listened to the deputy's report and then sat with his hands folded on his desk for a long moment that felt like it had geological weight. "Marsh is talking," Kane said finally. "What Marsh is saying is consistent with everything you brought me, and then some. He's provided detailed accounts of 3 instances, 3, not the 2 referenced in the unsigned letter, where he administered substances to individuals at Vaughn's instruction." He paused. "Your father is among them, Miss Mercer." Evelyn sat very still. "I'm sorry," Kane said, with the brevity of a man who understood that the word was insufficient and said it anyway. "I know," she said. Her voice didn't break. It did something else. Went very flat, very controlled, the way a person's voice goes when they are holding something that is too large for the moment and too important to put down. "I've known for some time. I needed it confirmed." "It's confirmed," Kane said. "Marsh has given sworn testimony." He looked at both of them. "Vaughn's flight doesn't change what happens to the people he left behind, or the charges, or the outcome for Cartwell. What it changes is the timeline. We issue a territorial warrant. Every marshal, every outpost, every crossing between here and the border carries his description. A man of his resources can run far, but not indefinitely." He paused. "He'll be found." "When?" Ronan said. "I can't give you a number," Kane said. "What I can tell you is that I intend to make finding him a priority that is difficult to ignore." He looked at Ronan steadily. "And what I need you to understand is that this does not change your role in what comes next." Ronan met his eyes. He understood what wasn't being said. "Don't go after him yourself. Don't turn this back into the thing it was before it was law." "I understand," Ronan said. Kane studied him for a moment, the way the judge had a habit of doing, the specific study of someone determining if the words matched the man. "There's something else," Kane said. "Cartwell. With Vaughn gone and his men in custody, the town is in a state of considerable uncertainty. There are accounts frozen, businesses that operated under his financing that don't know their status, people who have been afraid for a long time who are only now beginning to understand that the thing they were afraid of has collapsed." He paused. "I'm sending a territorial administrator in to manage the bank accounts and the legal proceedings. But the town needs something it can point to, a moment that makes the change visible and real." He looked at both of them. "I'd like you to return to Cartwell," he said, "with my deputies. Not as fugitives, as the people who brought this case forward." The ride back to Cartwell was nothing like the ride south had been. They traveled on the main road this time. No back ridges, no careful concealment, no managing the distance between themselves and observation. The territorial deputies rode alongside them, which was a different kind of visibility than the wanted posters had created. People on the road looked at them, and then looked again. The second look carrying the particular quality of recognition, mixed with confusion, mixed with the tentative recalculation of a story they'd been told that was now visibly wrong. Evelyn rode without speaking for the first 2 hours. Ronan let her. He understood the specific quality of this silence. She had spent weeks working toward the moment Kane's word confirmed had described, and now that the confirmation had arrived, it wasn't the release she might have hoped for. It was just the truth settling into the place where the uncertainty had been. And truth in that configuration was not comfortable. It was just real. "He knew," she said, finally. Not to Ronan particularly, just to the road ahead of them. "My father knew, and he wrote to me, and 3 weeks later he was gone, and I told myself—" She paused. "I told myself there was no way to be certain, that fever was fever, that I was letting my grief make shapes in the dark." "You weren't certain," Ronan said. "You suspected. There's a difference." "I know." She exhaled. "I just wish—" She didn't finish it. He didn't ask her to. They came into Cartwell in the late afternoon, and the effect of their arrival was something Ronan hadn't anticipated, which meant he'd underestimated the degree to which the town had been living in a particular kind of held-breath tension. The deputies rode in first, which established the legal frame. Then Ronan and Evelyn, which provided the human one. The street didn't erupt. It didn't cheer. What it did was something quieter, and in some ways more significant. It stopped. People on the boardwalk stopped what they were doing. Conversations paused. Someone came out of the general store and stood in the doorway and didn't go back in. And through this growing, accumulated stillness, as the party moved up the main street toward the bank, the town of Cartwell began to understand that the thing it had been afraid to look directly at for years was finally, irrevocably, in the past. Kane's administrator, a compact, precise man named Aldous, who had arrived from Fort Halloran ahead of them, was already at the bank when they pulled up. The doors were standing open, which they hadn't been for 2 days, and inside the sound of papers being organized and accounts being examined was audible from the street. One of the deputies dismounted and posted Kane's court order on the bank's front wall, next to, and then partially covering, the wanted poster that still bore Evelyn's name. She looked at this without expression for a moment. Then she looked away. Marshal Dent was located at the Cartwell Inn, where he had been apparently since the morning the arrest party arrived, which told its own story about what he'd known and when he'd known it and what he'd done with the information. He was escorted by 2 deputies to a separate room at Kane's directive for questioning that would determine the shape of his own legal situation. He did not look at Ronan or Evelyn as he passed them on the street. He looked at the ground with the expression of a man who had made a calculation that hadn't accounted for all the variables. The widow Hartley found Evelyn on the street outside the dry goods store, which was where Evelyn had gone first. Not to the bank, not to the house, but there, which Ronan understood was about the woman who had told the truth at personal cost. The widow was a small, sharp-eyed woman of about 60, wearing a dark wool coat that had been mended at the elbows, and she stood in front of Evelyn with her hands clasped together and looked at her with an expression that cycled through several things very quickly before settling on something that was mostly relief with grief running underneath it. "Your father was a good man," the widow said. "I know," Evelyn said. "He came to my house once when my husband was sick and couldn't work, and we were behind on payments to the bank. He came personally and told me the account had been adjusted." She paused. "I don't know how he managed it or what it cost him. He never said. He just said not to worry." Evelyn stood very still. "I wanted someone to know that," the widow said. "Someone who mattered." Evelyn reached forward and took the woman's hands in hers, briefly, and said something Ronan was too far away to hear. Whatever it was, the widow nodded twice, firmly, and then made the deliberate motion of a woman who has said the thing she needed to say and can now resume her day. Ronan watched Evelyn stand alone on the boardwalk for a moment after the widow went back inside. Her shoulders carried the particular set of someone who is holding something difficult and knows the holding is necessary and is doing it anyway. He crossed the street to her. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. They stood on the boardwalk together for a moment, and then he put his hand on her shoulder. Not a gesture of comfort exactly, because he wasn't built for comfort gestures, and she'd have known it was performance, but something more honest than that. Just the acknowledgement that she wasn't alone in the moment, stated the only way he knew how to state it. She put her hand over his briefly, 1 second, maybe 2. Then she straightened and said, "I need to go to the house." "I'll come," he said. Her father's house was on the residential street north of Maine, 2 blocks east of the Pollard house. It was smaller than Ronan had imagined. A narrow 2-story structure with the garden her father had apparently maintained gone to seed in the months since his death, and a front window that someone had covered from the inside with a cloth, the sign of a house that has been gone through and closed off. The lock had been changed, but the deputy who accompanied them had the authority to open it, and he did, and then stepped back and let them go in alone. It smelled of absence, closed rooms and old paper and the faint chemical trace of something that made Evelyn stop in the doorway for a half-second before continuing. "Camphor," she said quietly. "He used it for the cold, every winter." She moved into the front room. Burned it in a small dish near his desk. The desk was intact. Whatever Vaughn's men had taken, the documents, the damaging papers, they had left the furniture and the books and the small, accumulated physical evidence of a life that had been lived here. There was a geological sample on the corner of the desk, a piece of striated granite, labeled in her father's precise hand with a location and a date from 11 years ago. Evelyn picked it up and held it. She stood there for a moment with the granite in her hands, and Ronan stood near the door and gave her the room. He was thinking about Kane's words, that what Marsh had confirmed covered 3 instances, and that her father was among them. He was thinking about the specific mathematics of what it meant for a man to be murdered slowly, through careful chemistry, by someone paid to do it by someone who needed him silent. He was thinking about the widow Hartley's account adjusted and the words he never said what it cost him. It had cost him everything in the end. "We should find somewhere to stay tonight," Evelyn said, setting the granite down carefully where she'd found it. "Not the inn. Dent's there, and I don't want to be under the same roof." "There's a boarding house on the east end of Maine," Ronan said. "Bach mentioned it." "Then there," she said. They left the house as it was, not locked again, because Aldis's team would need access to the financial documents that might still be inside, but closed. The door pulled shut behind them, with the soft, final sound of a chapter being set aside rather than ended. That night, at the boarding house, they ate at the communal table with 3 other guests who clearly knew who they were and were managing varying degrees of wanting to ask questions. Ronan ate without contributing to the conversation. Evelyn answered 2 careful questions from a farmer who'd had dealings with Vaughn's bank and was anxious about what the account freeze meant for his spring planting loan, giving him enough honest information to work with without speculating beyond what she actually knew. After dinner, she sat by the boarding house fire, and Ronan sat across from her. And for a while, neither of them said anything, which was its own statement about how far they'd come from the weeks of working silences in the cabin. "There's something I've been meaning to say," Evelyn said. He waited. "When you walked into that chapel," she said, "I didn't know you. I didn't know if you were better or worse than Vaughn, or just a different version of the same problem." She paused. "I took the offer because the alternative was certain, and your option was only uncertain. That was the honest calculation." "I know," he said. "I didn't expect anything different. But it became—" She stopped, started again. "What it became wasn't the arrangement I calculated, and I want you to know that I know the difference." She looked at him directly, the way she did when she was being precise about something that mattered. "I know what you are, not the reputation, what you actually are." She paused. "And I want that said out loud because I don't think you hear it often enough to trust it." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not an easy person," he said. "I'm aware," she said. "I'm not asking for easy." The faintest trace of something dry entered her voice, the quality it got when she was being honest about something that was also slightly tender. "I'm not particularly easy myself." He looked at her across the fire. She was tired, genuinely tired, the kind that came from weeks of sustained effort and controlled fear and the specific exhaustion of caring about a thing hard enough to fight for it. She was not beautiful in the way of women who were decorative. She was something more difficult to describe and more difficult to look away from. "Whatever comes next," he said carefully, "whatever the rest of this looks like, I want you to know that what I said in the chapel is still true. What's mine is shared. That doesn't expire." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. "I know that." The fire burned between them. Outside Cartwell was settling into night, the particular night of a town that had just undergone a seismic shift and didn't yet know how to hold the new silence where the old fear used to be. The news about Vaughn's capture reached Fort Halloran first and Cartwell second, arriving 3 days after Ronan and Evelyn had returned to the cabin in the Blackstones. Bach brought it, as Bach brought everything, up the mountain trail on a Thursday morning, handing over the supply sack and then saying, with the economy of a man who had long since stopped treating information as performance, "They got him. Border crossing south of Heller's Pass, trying to get out of the territory with 2 horses and a locked case." "The case?" Ronan said. "Cash, bonds, some documents Kane's people are very interested in." Bach paused. He didn't resist. One witness said he looked, not surprised exactly, more like a man who'd been expecting the bill to come due and had been tired of waiting for it. Ronan absorbed this. "Pollard?" Evelyn said from the doorway, where she'd appeared at the sound of Bach's voice. Bach's expression shifted. "Alive. The independent physician's treatment, whatever Ansel prescribed after the examination, seems to be working. Slowly." He looked at her. "His wife said to tell you he's been asking if the papers reached the right hands." "They did," Evelyn said. "That's what I told her," Bach said. She cried again, apparently. It's become a habit with her. After Bach had gone, Ronan stood on the porch and looked out at the mountains. The season was turning, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the incremental ways that announced change to anyone paying attention. The light was different. The cold had a different quality. Down in the valley, the aspens would be beginning to change, though from up here they were too far away to see. Evelyn came to stand beside him on the porch. "It's done," she said. "Most of it," he said. "The parts that required us," she said. He considered this. "Yes, the parts that required us." She leaned against the porch rail and looked out at the same view. The long slope down through the pine, the granite above, the particular blue of the high-altitude sky. After a moment, she said, "I want to stay." He looked at her. "On the mountain," she said. "In the cabin." She paused. "With you." She said it the way she said most things that mattered, but plainly, without decoration, with the directness of someone who had decided that this particular truth deserved to be stated in its simplest form. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That was always an option." "I know. I wanted to say it anyway." She paused. "So it was chosen, not just accepted." He looked at her profile, the set of her jaw, the line of her shoulders, the quality of her attention resting on the mountains. "Then it's chosen," he said. She didn't smile. She did something subtler, a small released tension in her face, as if a question she'd been holding had been set down. "There's work to do," she said, pushing off from the rail. "The woodpile is low and the cold room needs restocking before it actually gets cold." "I know," he said. She went inside. He stayed on the porch for another minute, looking out at the mountains that had been his exile and his punishment and his only honest home for 10 years. That had become something different in the space of a few months. Something still demanding, still ungenerous with comfort, still requiring everything you had, but different in the particular way of a place that is no longer where you went alone. Then he went inside too. Emmett Pollard died 12 days later, on a cold night in early winter, with his wife beside him and the knowledge that what he'd written on that shaky piece of paper had reached the right hands. Kane sent word. Evelyn received it at the cabin with the specific stillness she reserved for things that were true and heavy and required sitting with. Ronan found her at the table that evening with the lamp turned low, not working, just sitting. He sat across from her. "He knew," she said. "When he wrote those account numbers down for me, he knew it might not be enough time. He did it anyway." "Yes," Ronan said. "That's courage," she said. Not the kind that gets written about, just doing the thing that's right when you're already losing and it won't save you personally. She paused. My father was the same way. He looked at her. I come from people who did the right thing when it cost them, she said. I want to remember that. She paused again and then said something that cost her something to say. I want you to know that I think you're one of those people too, whatever you believe about what you've done. Ronan sat with that for a moment. It was not easy to receive. He was not built for receiving it easily. I'm trying to be, he said. She looked at him across the low-lit table. And for a moment, the cabin held both of them in the specific warmth of a place that had been built alone and was now, unmistakably, shared. That's enough, she said. Trying is enough. Outside the mountain held its dark and cold. Inside the fire burned. And the two people sitting at the table in its light were, in the way of people who have survived something together and come out the other side holding more than they went in with, exactly where they were supposed to be. Winter came to the Blackstone Mountains the way it always did. Not as a single event, but as a series of small surrenders, each one unremarkable on its own, until the morning you woke up and the world outside the cabin window was white and still and entirely committed to the fact of itself. Ronan and Evelyn moved through the first weeks of it with the practiced efficiency of people who had stopped negotiating with the season and started simply working within it. The woodpile was high. The cold room was stocked. The cabin was as tight as he'd spent 10 years making it, and it held the warmth adequately, which was the most honest thing you could say about any structure at this altitude. They had also, sometime in the weeks between Pollard's death and the first snowfall, stopped sleeping in separate quarters. This had happened without announcement or ceremony, the way most of the significant things between them had happened, through a series of small adjustments and honest moments until the distance that had existed at the beginning was simply no longer present, and neither of them felt the need to remark on its absence. What they had was not easy and had never pretended to be. He was still prone to long silences that required her to decide whether they were moods or simply the way he processed things, and she was still precise in ways that occasionally read as cold until you understood that her precision was how she expressed care. They disagreed about small things with a regularity that suggested they were both people with actual opinions rather than people performing compatibility, and they let those disagreements be what they were without catastrophizing them. It wasn't a soft life, it was a real one, and the difference mattered. The trial, what the Cartwell papers were calling the Vaughn proceedings, began in Fort Halloran in late winter. Kane presided. The testimony was extensive. Evelyn was called to appear on 2 occasions, and both times she rode down from the mountain with the oilcloth packet in her coat, the original documents, which Kane had returned to her after copies were entered into the court record, and sat before the court and answered questions with the same precise directness she brought to everything. Ronan attended both sessions, sitting in the gallery, watching. He watched the court and he watched Cedric Vaughn, who sat at the defense table in clothes that still fit him well, and with the posture of a man who had not entirely abandoned the performance of power, even with the evidence mounted against him. Vaughn looked older than he had in the chapel, not broken. Men like Vaughn didn't break. They contracted, hardening inward around whatever was left, but smaller somehow. The room had a different shape without the fear he'd used to fill it. On the second day of Evelyn's testimony, Vaughn's attorney attempted to characterize her documents as fabricated, a desperate narrative constructed by a woman with a personal grievance and a husband whose violent history made him a convenient instrument. The attorney said this with the smooth confidence of someone who had used this kind of argument before and found it effective. Evelyn sat through it without expression. When the attorney finished, Kane gave her the opportunity to respond, and she did so in the manner of someone who had anticipated this specific argument and prepared accordingly. Walking the court methodically through the chain of evidence, the corroboration between her father's ledger and Pollard's testimony and Marcia's confession, the consistency of detail across 3 independent sources, none of whom had coordinated their accounts. She spoke for 40 minutes. She did not raise her voice once. When she finished, the attorney had no useful follow-up, and Vaughn was looking at the surface of the table in front of him. Ronan thought, watching this, about the woman who had stood in a chapel with white-knuckled hands and a fixed stare at the middle distance. She was not that woman anymore. She had not been that woman for some time. What she was now was harder to describe in simple terms. Not harder, not colder, but more fully inhabited, more present in her own life in a way that the auction and the debt and the years of managing a dying man's financial ruin had evidently not allowed her to be. He also thought about what it had cost to become that. The months of work, the cold rides, the documents in the oilcloth, the shaky lines of a dying man's handwriting. None of it had been clean, none of it had arrived without something being asked of her that she hadn't anticipated giving. The verdict came on a Thursday in late February, and it was the kind of verdict that used many words to say a simple thing. Cedric Vaughn was guilty of fraud, of embezzlement, of conspiracy in the deaths of 3 men, including Thomas Mercer, accountant, who had been a good man and had asked the wrong questions at the wrong time and had paid for it. The sentence was delivered the following day. It was not a lenient one. When Ronan and Evelyn rode out of Fort Halloran after the sentencing, the sky above the southern valley was the specific gray-white of late winter, working itself toward reluctant spring, and they rode for a while without speaking, both of them carrying the particular silence of people who have been working toward something for a long time, and have now arrived at it and are discovering that arrival is its own kind of adjustment. "How do you feel?" Ronan asked when they were clear of the town. Evelyn considered this with the honesty she brought to questions that deserved it. "Tired," she said, "and not empty. That's not the right word. More like a room where heavy furniture has been moved out." She paused. "It doesn't feel the way I thought it would. I thought it would feel like more." "Justice usually doesn't feel like enough," Ronan said. "It's just the closest thing to enough that the world has." She looked at him. "Is that from experience?" "From 10 years of thinking about it," he said. She was quiet for a moment, the horses moving steadily north on the road that would eventually fork toward the Blackstone Trail. "My father is still gone," she said. "Pollard is still gone. Vaughn going to prison doesn't undo that." "No," he said, "it doesn't." "I know that's not a flaw in justice," she said. "That's just how loss works. It doesn't resolve. It just becomes part of the structure of things." She looked at the road ahead. "I think I'm coming to understand that." He didn't offer anything easier. She wouldn't have wanted it. They were 3 days from the cabin when they hit the pass. It was the narrow section of the mountain trail that Ronan had used the most cautiously since the whole of this began. A natural choke point, granite walls rising on both sides. The trail compressed to single file for about 40 yards before it opened again onto the long slope down toward their valley. He'd never liked this section. Too little room to move, too easy for someone to hold from either end. He was thinking about nothing in particular when the figure appeared at the far end of the pass. The man was mounted. He was sitting very still on a dark horse, positioned dead center in the trail, in the way of someone who had been waiting rather than arriving. He wore a heavy coat against the cold and had a rifle across his lap, and his face was visible beneath the hat brim. Young, maybe 25, with the particular tight expression of someone who had been carrying a plan inside them for a long time and had finally arrived at the moment of it. Ronan's hand went to the revolver at his hip, automatic, the reflex of 10 years. Then he stopped. He looked at the man's face, at the jaw, the cheekbones, the set of the eyes. He knew that face. Not this version of it. This was younger, raw, not yet carved by whatever the fathers had been carved by. But the bones of it were unmistakable. "Crow," Ronan said. The man's eyes moved to him and held there with the fixed quality of someone who has decided that looking away is the beginning of losing. "Darius Crow," the man said, not as introduction, as confirmation, as the statement of something he'd been rehearsing. Ronan heard Evelyn's horse stop behind him. He did not look back at her. Darius Crow was the youngest son of Warren Crow, who was among the 4 men Ronan had killed in the Garrick feud. One of the 2 he carried. Warren Crow had not been a good man, had not been innocent of the things that brought the feud to its final stage. But he'd also had a family that hadn't chosen the feud, and the math of what the feud had cost that family was a different math than the one Ronan had been doing when he was inside it. He had thought about this many times on the mountain, had not known what to do with the thinking. "I've been looking for you for 3 years, Darius said. His voice was controlled, but the control was the kind that had been maintained through effort rather than ease. "You're not easy to find when you don't want to be found." "No," Ronan said. "You killed my father." "Yes," Ronan said. He didn't say anything else. He didn't explain or contextualize or offer the version of events that made his actions more comprehensible, because Darius Crowe had spent 3 years building toward this moment and deserved to finish his sentence without Ronan managing the room. He wasn't a good man, Darius said, which was not what Ronan had expected. The words came out with the specific weight of something that had been arrived at through pain rather than received cleanly. I know that. I've known that for a long time. That doesn't... He stopped, started again. It doesn't change what you did. No, Ronan said, it doesn't. I want you to tell me why. Darius's jaw was tight. Not the story everyone tells about the Garrick feud. I want to hear it from you, what you told yourself when you did it. This was a harder question than a bullet would have been. Ronan understood that. I told myself it was survival, Ronan said, for the first 2. After that, he paused, because the honest version of this was not the version that made him look like someone worth hearing. After that, I was inside something I didn't know how to get out of. And your father came at me in a moment when I'd stopped making distinctions. The past was silent, except for the wind working between the granite walls. You'd stopped making distinctions, Darius repeated. The bitterness in it was clean, not theatrical. Yes, Ronan said. That's not an excuse, it's what happened. Then something shifted in the past, not a sound, not a movement, but a change in the quality of what was about to happen, the way the air changes before weather. Evelyn moved her horse forward, not fast, slowly, deliberately, pulling up alongside Ronan and then past him, placing herself between the 2 men without drama, without any quality of performance, just the specific intention of a woman who had decided that this moment required something other than what was about to occur. Darius's eyes went to her. I don't know you, Evelyn said, not unkindly, with the directness she reserved for things that mattered and didn't have time for preamble. I don't know you either, Darius said. My name is Evelyn Hale, she said. My father was killed by a man who needed him silent. I spent months working to make sure that man answered for it, and I'm going to tell you something that I had to learn the hard way, that I don't think anyone told you when you needed to hear it. Darius watched her. The rifle was still across his lap. What you're carrying, she said, is grief. I know what it looks like because I've been carrying it too. And grief it's enormous, and it's real, and it does not lie to you about the size of what you've lost. She paused. But the story grief tells you about what to do with itself. That story is not trustworthy. Because grief will tell you that the only thing big enough to match the size of the loss is an equivalent act of destruction, and it's wrong. She held his eyes. I know it's wrong because I've stood close enough to that edge to see what's at the bottom, and what's at the bottom is not relief. What's at the bottom is just more of what you started with, except now you've added to it. Darius said nothing, but his hands on the rifle had stilled. Your father is gone, Evelyn said. Her voice was even, not gentle, not hard, simply honest. That is a true and terrible thing, and the man in front of me did something he carries. I know he carries it because I know him well enough to know the weight of things he doesn't put down. She paused. But shooting him in a mountain pass does not bring your father back. It does not make the loss mean something. It makes it larger. It adds your life to the things destroyed by a feud that already took more than it should have. You don't know what it's like, Darius said. The bitterness was still there, but something else had entered his voice. Something that was fighting with the bitterness for space. No, she said. I don't know exactly what it's like for you, but I know what it's like to want someone to pay a price large enough to match what was taken. She paused. And I know what it's like to realize that the price you're asking for can only be paid by yourself. The wind moved through the pass. The horses stood patient and cold. Somewhere above them, a bird called once and then went silent. Darius Crowe looked at Ronan Hale. Ronan met his eyes without looking away, without offering anything easier than what was there. No appeal for mercy, no self-justification, just the acknowledgement of a man who had made choices he could not undo and had been carrying them for exactly as long as they deserved to be carried. I'm not going to tell you to forgive him, Evelyn said. Forgiveness is not something anyone else can prescribe. But I will tell you that walking away from this pass is a different kind of courage than pulling that trigger. and that the men who build something out of the wreckage of what was done to them are rarer and harder to kill than the men who just passed the wreckage on. The silence stretched. Then Darius Crow lifted the rifle off his lap. Ronan's hand tightened on the revolver, but Darius set the rifle in the scabbard at his saddle. He looked at Evelyn and then at Ronan, and whatever was moving through him in that moment was complex and unresolved, and would probably remain so for years. Which was honest, because the resolution of something like this was not a single moment's work. It was the work of a long time, and it started here, imperfectly, with a decision made in a cold mountain pass for reasons that were not simple. "I need to think," Darius said. "That's the right thing to do," Evelyn said. He looked at Ronan one more time. "This isn't over." "I know," Ronan said, "but it can be something other than this." Darius turned his horse. He rode back through the pass and up the trail that branched east, and they watched him until the trail curved and the pine took him from sight. And then the pass was empty and the mountains were just mountains again. Ronan sat on his horse and did not move for a moment. His hand came away from the revolver. He noticed it was shaking slightly, which was the body catching up to what the mind had been managing for the past several minutes. Evelyn turned her horse and looked at him. She didn't say, "Are you all right?" because she knew the answer was complicated, and she wasn't interested in the uncomplicated version. What she said was, "That was never going to end any other way." He looked at her. "You don't know that." "I know you," she said, "and I know what you've spent 10 years becoming." She held his gaze. "You weren't going to shoot that boy." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I might have." "You might have been afraid you would," she said. "That's different." He exhaled. It came out unsteady, which he allowed because they were alone in a mountain pass, and she had already seen most of the unsteady parts of him and had not adjusted her position accordingly. "What you said to him," Ronan said. "Yes, you believed it." "Every word," she said, including the part about knowing what it's like to stand at the edge. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in her face that was tired and real and utterly without performance. The face of a woman who had given something of herself in that pass and knew it and was not asking for acknowledgement of the cost. "Come on," she said. "We're 2 days from home and the cold is getting worse." They rode out of the pass and down the long slope toward the Blackstone Valley, and the mountains closed around them with the particular quality of a place that has no opinion about human suffering but provides, reliably, continuity. The same trees, the same stone, the same trail worn by years of passage, the same creek audible below when the wind stilled. Home. He thought about that word, had not used it for himself for a very long time, had thought of the cabin as shelter, as refuge, as the practical solution to the problem of being alive in a place that would otherwise kill you. Home was a different thing. Home required something that shelter didn't, required that you were not merely enduring the space but inhabiting it, that it held something you would miss, that leaving it was a cost and not just a logistical inconvenience. The cabin now was home, had been for some time. He had a woman who chose the mountain in full knowledge of what it was. He had evidence that the world's machinery of justice, slow and imperfect and frequently for sale, could nevertheless occasionally produce the right outcome. He had the specific knowledge that the worst thing he'd believed about himself, that his violence was permanent and definitive, that the exile was the only honest version of his future, was not, in fact, the last word on the subject. These were not small things. Spring arrived the way it always arrived in the Blackstones, grudgingly, in increments, taking back half of every concession it made before finally committing. The snow retreated up the slopes. The creek below the cabin ran high and loud with melt. The pines released their particular sharp smell into the warming air, and the birds that had gone south for winter began the process of returning, testing the territory before committing to it, the way cautious things do. Evelyn planted a garden. She had planned it through the winter, had spent evenings with seed catalogs that Bach brought up on his route, making notes in the margin with the same precise attention she brought to everything that interested her. The garden was on the south-facing slope below the cabin, which got the most light, and she laid it out with the deliberate logic of someone who understood that a thing built carefully in the right conditions would produce more than one built quickly in the wrong ones. Ronan helped with the heavy work, breaking the ground where it was still compacted, building the low stone border that would keep the deer at a respectful distance, and watched her work the rest with the focused pleasure of someone doing a thing they'd chosen for reasons entirely their own. She was 4 months along by then. She had told him on an evening in early March with the directness that was simply how she operated, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around a coffee cup and her eyes on his face in the manner of someone prepared to receive a complicated reaction without judgment. He hadn't given her a complicated reaction. What he'd felt in that moment was something he didn't have quick access to words for. Not simple happiness, which would have been inadequate, but something larger and more frightened and more right than happiness. He'd sat with it for a moment, and then he'd put his hand over hers on the table, which was the most honest thing he could think to do. She'd exhaled. They'd sat there for a while without talking, which was, by then, one of the things they did best. Word reached them in May that Darius Crowe had returned to his family's land in the Eastern Valley and taken up the farming work that his father had left unfinished. The source was Bach, who knew this because Bach knew everything that moved between settlements in a 100-mile radius and filtered it with the judgment of someone who understood which pieces of information were worth passing on. "He's not causing trouble," Bach said. "Seems to be just working." He paused. Bought seed at the Heller's Pass trading post. Asked about soil conditions in the Eastern Valley, the kind of questions a man asks when he's planning to stay somewhere. Ronan didn't say anything. "I thought you'd want to know," Bach said. "I did," Ronan said. He told Evelyn that evening. She was weeding the garden with the careful patience she brought to things that required repetitive attention, and she looked up when he told her and then looked back at the ground and said, "Good." One word, but she said it with the quality of something genuinely meant. He sat on the low stone wall of the garden and watched her work, and thought about Darius Crowe, on a piece of land in the Eastern Valley, planting something in the ground in the spring, choosing the work of building over the work of destroying. It was not resolution. The grief was still there. The loss was still there. The complicated, unfinished mathematics of what had happened between their families was still there. But it was a different direction. A harder one, arguably. The kind that was worth something. In June, a letter arrived from Kane's court through Bach's route. It was brief and formal, and said what it needed to say. The full extent of Vaughn's fraudulent land acquisitions had been documented. The properties involved were being returned to their rightful owners or heirs through the court's administration, and the financial accounts that had been frozen during the investigation had been resolved in favor of the legitimate creditors. Thomas Mercer's debts, the debts that had set everything in motion, were formally discharged. Evelyn Mercer Hale was recognized as her father's heir with clean title. Evelyn read the letter twice at the kitchen table. Then she folded it and set it beside the granite sample that she had brought from her father's desk and placed on the shelf near the window, the striated stone with his handwriting on the label, the small preserved evidence of a man who had been curious about the world and had been a good man in it. She stood there for a moment with her back to the room. Ronan waited. "It's done," she said. The same words she'd said in Fort Halloran after the sentencing, but different now. Less the arrival at a destination and more the closing of a door that could now stay closed. "Yes," he said. She turned around. She was showing fully now, the pregnancy past the months of ambiguity, and she put one hand briefly on the side of her belly in the unconscious way she'd developed recently. A gesture that wasn't performance, but just the new physical fact of herself. "I want to go to his grave," she said, "before the summer is fully on. I want to take some of the early flowers from the garden." She paused. "And I want to tell him it's done. I know he can't hear it. I just want to say it somewhere he was." "We'll go," Ronan said. They rode down to Cartwell in the last week of June, when the valley was fully green and the days had the long golden quality of early summer. The town looked different from what it had been in the fall. Not dramatically, not transformed, but with the specific difference of a place that has exhaled. The bank was operating under new management. The mill had changed hands. The houses on the residential streets had the appearance of places where people were living rather than managing. The widow Hartley, encountered on Main Street, hugged Evelyn with a warmth that was entirely unself-conscious and looked at Ronan with the expression of a woman who had revised her opinion of someone and was not embarrassed about the revision. Evelyn left flowers at her father's grave in the small cemetery on the eastern edge of town. She stood there for a while in the summer morning, and Ronan stood a respectful distance behind her and let her have the time and the privacy of it. He thought about Thomas Mercer, whom he had never met, the man who had asked too many questions because he was honest and had died for it, the man who had adjusted the widow Hartley's account and never said what it cost him, the man whose daughter had ridden into the Blackstone Mountains as a calculation of survival and had become something that changed the shape of Ronan's life in ways he was still discovering. He thought about the kind of courage that didn't look like courage from the outside, the kind that happened quietly, in account books and letters hidden in desk drawers and shaky handwriting on a sick man's paper, the kind that didn't announce itself. He thought about how much of the world's functioning depended on exactly that kind of courage, and how rarely it was recognized until after the person who carried it was gone. When Evelyn turned away from the grave, she walked back to him and took his arm with the naturalness of a thing that had been established, and they walked back through the cemetery gate together. "He would have liked you," she said. Ronan considered this. "I'm not sure about that." "He would have been cautious at first," she said. "He was always cautious with people, but he valued people who did what they said and said what they meant. And you are that." She paused. "He would have liked you eventually." "Eventually is enough," Ronan said. She looked at him sideways, the specific look she gave him when something he'd said had landed differently than he'd intended. Not badly, just with a quality she was filing away. "Yes," she said. "It is." They rode back up into the mountains in the afternoon, and the cabin came into view around the last bend in the trail with the particular quality it had taken on over the months. Not grand, not changed, just itself, the low pine structure with the covered south-facing porch, and the woodpile in the garden, now full and growing on the slope below. He had built this place as a place to disappear into. It had become something a man came back to. That was the difference. A daughter was born in August in the cabin, with a midwife from the valley who had climbed the mountain trail with her bag and her professional composure and her firm, practical competence, and who left the following morning with the satisfied expression of someone whose work had gone as work is supposed to go. They named her after no one in particular, and everyone in a general way. A name that was its own thing, not inherited, not assigned. Clara. 2 syllables, nothing complicated, the name of a person who had not yet done anything and could therefore do anything. Ronan held her on the porch in the early morning of her second day, in the specific light of late summer, the kind that came over the eastern peaks and moved through the pines with the quality of something that had come a long way to arrive here. She was small and impractical and demanded things he had never been asked to provide before, and she had Evelyn's jaw already, which seemed right. He thought about all of it. The chapel, the mountain, the papers in the oilcloth, the pass where Darius Crowe had lowered a rifle. He thought about the weight of things you carry and the weight of things you put down, and how the difference between those two actions was sometimes just the presence of someone who stood beside you and said, "It can be something other than this." He thought about what it meant to be afraid of yourself, of your own capacity for damage, and to be given, against all reasonable expectation, the opportunity to discover that the capacity was not the whole story. The mountains were the same mountains they had always been. The pine smell was the same pine smell. The light moved across the granite the same way it had always moved, without opinion, without mercy, without comfort, but with the absolute reliability of something that would continue. And in the middle of it, this. The small, warm weight in his arms, the sound of Evelyn moving in the cabin behind him, the garden below starting to produce its late summer abundance, the cradle he'd spent 3 evenings building in the light of the lamp. He was not a different man than he had been. He was not healed or absolved or made simple. He still carried the weight of the 4 men whose faces he knew, and he would carry it to the end of things, because that was honest and anything else would be a lie he owed them not to tell. But he was also this. A man standing on a porch in the Blackstone Mountains in the early morning, holding his daughter in a life he had not designed and could not have predicted and would not, if offered the chance, exchange for the silence he'd had before. The exile had not ended. It had transformed into something else, into a choice rather than a sentence. That was the difference between running from a life and building one. That was, he thought, looking out at the mountains and the light and the long green slope of the valley below. Enough. More than enough, it was in the imperfect and demanding and irreplaceable way of things that are actually real, everything.